The cold bit at Frank Henderson's skin as he stirred awake. It was the kind of cold that seeped through layers of clothing, gnawed at the bones, and made even the smallest movement feel like a chore. For a moment, Frank forgot where he was. His head rested against the rough brick wall of the office building, and his thin blanket, more holes than fabric, offered little comfort against the chill of the early morning. The sound of footsteps echoed nearby, pulling him from his half-sleep. Two figures in uniforms loomed over him. Security guards. Frank's heart sank. He had been here before. "Hey, old man," one of them barked, tapping his baton against the concrete. "You can't stay here. Get up." Frank sat up slowly, his joints protesting with every movement. His knees ached, his back screamed, but he said nothing. He wasn't a man of many words, not anymore. He started gathering his meager belongings: a tattered backpack, a crumpled photo of a young girl, and a small, weathered American flag folded neatly at the bottom. "Did you hear me?" the guard repeated, his tone sharper now. "This is private property. You're trespassing." "I wasn't bothering anyone," Frank muttered, his voice hoarse and scratchy. "Rules are rules," the second guard chimed in, less aggressive but no less firm. Frank tried to stand, but his legs betrayed him. He stumbled, catching himself on the edge of the step. The first guard grabbed his arm to steady him, but the gesture felt more like a restraint. "We're calling the cops," the guard said. "I'm leaving," Frank insisted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Just give me a minute." But it was too late. A patrol car pulled up moments later, its flashing lights piercing the quiet dawn. Frank sighed deeply, his breath visible in the freezing air. The officer who stepped out was young, probably no older than 25. He looked at Frank with a mixture of pity and annoyance. "Sir, you're under arrest for trespassing," the officer said, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. Frank didn't resist. He simply raised his hands, his thin wrists trembling in the icy air. A few pedestrians stopped to watch, their eyes filled with curiosity or indifference. A woman across the street pulled out her phone and started recording. "Can't believe this," she muttered loudly enough for others to hear. "They're arresting a homeless man?" As the officer guided Frank into the back seat of the patrol car, Frank caught sight of the building's name etched into the glass doors: Bridgman Tower. It loomed above him, a monolith of wealth and power, utterly indifferent to the man being hauled away at its steps. Inside the car, Frank stared out the window, his reflection staring back at him. His weathered face told the story of a hard life. The deep lines around his eyes, the grizzled beard that hadn't seen a razor in weeks, the haunted look of a man who had lost more than he had ever gained. As the patrol car drove off, the city began to wake. Coffee shops opened their doors, commuters hurried to catch buses, and the world continued as if Frank Henderson didn't exist. But the video of his arrest did. By the time he reached the station, it had already been posted online, garnering its first wave of views. The caption read, "Arrested for being homeless. A 76-year-old veteran left out in the cold." It was only the beginning of a story that no one, not even Frank, could have seen coming. Frank sat silently in the holding cell, his arms wrapped tightly around his chest to keep warm. The fluorescent lights above buzzed faintly, casting an unforgiving glow on the gray concrete walls. Time passed slowly here, each minute stretching endlessly. He closed his eyes and let his mind wander, but the past always came rushing back, unbidden and relentless. There was a time when Frank Henderson was someone else, someone strong, capable, and full of purpose. The year was 1969, and the jungle was alive with sounds. Helicopters thudded overhead, the smell of smoke hung in the humid air, and Frank was crouched behind a tree, clutching his rifle. His squad had been ambushed, and his commanding officer lay bleeding out just a few feet away. "Frank, get over here," a voice shouted. Without hesitation, Frank sprinted across the clearing, bullets whizzing past him. He slid to his knees beside his CO, applying pressure to the wound. The man was gasping for air, his face pale. "You're gonna make it, sir," Frank said, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. He didn't believe it, but he had to say it. That's what a good soldier did, kept others calm even when the world was falling apart. Frank carried his CO out of that jungle that day, earning himself a Bronze Star for valor. But the medals meant little to him. The war left more scars than accolades, scars he carried long after the fighting was done. When Frank returned home in the early 1970s, America was not the country he had left behind. The welcome he'd imagined, a hero's return, maybe a parade or a few handshakes, never came. Instead, there were protests, angry chants, and cold stares from strangers who viewed him as a symbol of an unpopular war. He tried to move on, to blend into civilian life. He worked odd jobs, construction, warehouse shifts, even a short stint as a security guard. But none of it felt right. The nights were the worst. He'd wake up drenched in sweat, haunted by the faces of men he couldn't save. The first time he walked into a VA clinic, he waited for hours only to be told they couldn't help him right away. The second time, the line was even longer. By the third time, he stopped going altogether. Frank tried to build a life. He married a woman named Linda, and for a while, things were good. They had a daughter, Emily, a bright-eyed girl with an infectious laugh that could light up a room. But Frank's demons followed him home. The nightmares, the flashbacks, they made him irritable, distant. Linda tried to help, but eventually, the weight of it all became too much. She left, taking Emily with her. Sitting in that holding cell, Frank rubbed his hands together, trying to shake off the memories. He hadn't seen Emily in over 30 years. He wondered what she looked like now, whether she ever thought about him. "Hey, old man," a voice interrupted his thoughts. The guard stood outside the cell door, holding a clipboard. "You've got a court date next week. Trespassing." Frank nodded wordlessly. The guard hesitated. "Look, I read the report. Says here you're a vet. That true?" Frank looked up, his eyes weary. "Yeah." The guard scratched the back of his neck awkwardly. "My dad was in Desert Storm. I'm sorry you're in here." Frank didn't respond. He had heard it all before. The pity, the apologies that didn't change a thing. As the guard walked away, Frank leaned back against the wall and closed his eyes again. He wasn't sure when his life had unraveled completely, only that it had. One bad day turned into a bad week, then a bad year, until the streets became his home. And now, at 76, he was here, homeless, arrested, and utterly alone. But somewhere in the city, Sarah, the young journalist who had shared the video of his arrest, was scrolling through comments on her post. Messages of outrage poured in. How could this happen to a veteran? Shame on our system. Does anyone know how we can help him? Sarah leaned forward, intrigued. She decided then and there to find out who Frank Henderson was. She had no idea the story she was about to uncover would change everything, not just for Frank, but for her as well. The courtroom was eerily quiet, save for the shuffling of papers and the faint hum of the ceiling fan. Frank sat at the defendant's table, shoulders hunched, his weathered hands resting in his lap. He wore the same clothes he had been arrested in, a faded, oversized coat and jeans patched so many times they barely resembled denim anymore. Across the room, the prosecutor reviewed her notes, her sharp suit and determined expression a stark contrast to Frank's disheveled appearance. The judge, an older man with a stern face, entered the room, and everyone stood briefly before settling back into their seats. Case number 2376, Frank Henderson, charged with trespassing, the clerk announced. Frank's lawyer, Michael Adams, a young public defender with a rumpled suit and an air of quiet determination, leaned toward him. "Don't say anything unless I tell you to, okay?" Frank nodded. He wasn't planning to say much anyway. The prosecutor stood, addressing the court. "Your Honor, the defendant was found on private property, Bridgman Tower, despite repeated warnings from security to vacate the premises. This is a clear-cut case of trespassing, and we are seeking a fine or, failing that, a brief jail sentence as a deterrent." Michael stood. "Your Honor, the defendant is a 76-year-old homeless veteran who had no malicious intent. He was merely seeking shelter from the cold. Jail time or a fine would be not only unjust but also unnecessarily punitive." The judge raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Adams, while I appreciate your sentiment, the law is the law. Was your client aware that he was on private property?" Michael hesitated, then sighed. Yes, Your Honor, but the judge held up a hand. Then I see no reason this case should not proceed to trial. However, I'll set the court date for next week to allow both sides to prepare their arguments. The gavel struck, signaling the end of the hearing. Frank exhaled slowly, a sound more like a wheeze than a breath. He felt the weight of the room, the stares of strangers who likely saw him as nothing more than another unfortunate face in an endless sea of human suffering. Outside the courthouse, the cold air hit Frank like a slap. Michael walked beside him, his breath visible in the frosty morning. "You holding up okay?" Michael asked. Frank shrugged. "Been through worse." Michael paused, studying the older man. "Look, I know you didn't ask for this, but I'm not going to let them steamroll you. I'm going to fight for you, okay?" Frank glanced at him, his gray eyes dull but searching. "Why? Why do you care?" Michael smiled faintly. "My grandfather was a World War II vet. If he were still around and in your shoes, I'd want someone to stand up for him too." Frank didn't respond, but for the first time in years, he felt a faint flicker of gratitude. Meanwhile, Sarah was sitting in a coffee shop, her laptop open and her phone buzzing nonstop. The video of Frank's arrest had gone viral, racking up thousands of views in just a few hours. Her inbox was flooded with messages, some from veterans, others from advocacy groups, and even a few from people who claimed to know Frank. One message caught her attention. It was from a man named Thomas, who said he had served with Frank in Vietnam. "Frank was one of the best soldiers I knew. He saved lives, including mine. If he's in trouble, let me know how I can help." Sarah leaned back in her chair, chewing on the end of her pen. She had been chasing stories for years, but something about this one felt different. It wasn't just a story. It was a responsibility. Later that evening, Frank shuffled into the shelter where he spent most nights. The place smelled of damp clothes and faint disinfectant. He found a cot in the corner and sat down heavily, pulling out the crumpled photo of his daughter from his backpack. Emily had been 7 years old when the photo was taken, her toothy grin lighting up the frame. Frank traced the outline of her face with his finger, his hand trembling slightly. "I wonder if you'd even recognize me now," he murmured to himself. Unknown to Frank, his face was plastered across social media, news outlets, and television screens. The world was starting to pay attention, but Frank wasn't sure if that was a blessing or a curse. For now, all he knew was that he had a court date, a determined lawyer, and a long, uncertain road ahead. The next morning, Frank woke to the faint hum of conversation in the shelter. A volunteer was passing out lukewarm coffee, and the usual sounds of coughing, muttering, and shuffling feet filled the air. Frank rubbed his eyes, wincing at the stiffness in his joints. Another day, another battle to survive. But outside, the world was already buzzing with his name. Sarah sat in front of her computer, scrolling through comments on her viral post. It had surpassed 500,000 views overnight. People were enraged, confused, and heartbroken by the sight of an elderly homeless veteran being led away in handcuffs. "This is how we treat our heroes," one comment read, with dozens of replies agreeing. "Where's the humanity?" another wrote. And then there were messages of action. "How can we help this man? Let's organize something. He deserves better." The video had even caught the attention of local news stations. As Sarah sipped her coffee, her phone buzzed with an incoming call. She hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello? Sarah, this is Andrea from Channel 7 News," the voice said briskly. "We've been following your story about the homeless veteran. We'd love to interview you and, if possible, Mr. Henderson. Do you have access to him?" Sarah blinked. I don't. Not yet. But I was planning to find him today." Andrea's voice softened. "If you can track him down, let us know. This could be big, Sarah. Stories like this make waves." Sarah hung up and grabbed her coat, her mind racing. She didn't want to just tell Frank's story. She wanted to help him. But first, she had to find him. At the same time, Frank was heading to the courthouse to meet Michael. The young lawyer had promised to go over their strategy for the upcoming trial. Frank wasn't sure what strategy meant in a case like his. He had trespassed, after all, but Michael had seemed confident. As Frank approached the courthouse, he noticed a small group of people gathered on the steps. At first, He thought they were just lingering bystanders. But as he got closer, he realized they were holding signs. One read, "Support our veterans." Another said, "Housing, not handcuffs." Frank paused, confused. Were these people here for him? A middle-aged man holding a sign noticed Frank and called out, "Hey, it's him." The group turned to look, and for a moment, Frank wanted to turn and walk away. But then a woman approached him, her face kind and her voice steady. "Mr. Henderson," she asked, "we saw the video of your arrest. We're here to support you. What happened to you isn't right." Frank stared at her, his throat tightening. He had spent years being invisible, ignored by society. The sudden attention was overwhelming. I don't know what to say," he murmured. "You don't have to say anything," the woman said. "We're here for you." Inside the courthouse, Michael was waiting. When Frank walked in, Michael greeted him with a firm handshake. "You see those people outside?" Michael asked, nodding toward the group. Frank nodded, still bewildered. "Yeah, what's going on?" Michael smiled. "People care, Frank. Your story's out there now, and they want to make sure you're heard." Frank frowned. "I didn't ask for any of this." "I know," Michael said gently, "but maybe it's time someone stood up for you, don't you think?" Frank didn't respond. He wasn't sure how to process the idea that strangers, people who didn't know him, were fighting for him. Meanwhile, Sarah was visiting shelters and soup kitchens, asking if anyone had seen Frank. At one shelter, a volunteer recognized his description. "Yeah, Frank stays here sometimes," the man said. "Quiet guy. Keeps to himself. He might be at the courthouse right now. Something about a trespassing charge." Sarah thanked him and hurried off, her determination growing. As the day went on, the momentum behind Frank's story continued to build. News stations picked up the video, veterans groups began organizing, and social media campaigns demanded justice. Hashtag Help Frank Henderson started trending on Twitter, with users sharing their own stories of homeless veterans and calling for systemic change. Frank's life, once marked by quiet suffering, was now at the center of a national conversation. But for Frank, it was all a storm he didn't know how to weather. Sitting on a bench outside the courthouse, he clutched the folded flag in his hands. It was the one thing he had kept from his time in Vietnam, a reminder of the man he used to be. "All this attention," he muttered to himself. "What does it even mean?" He didn't know it yet, but the world was about to answer that question for him. Frank stared at her, his throat tightening. He had spent years being invisible, ignored by society. The sudden attention was overwhelming. I don't know what to say," he murmured. "You don't have to say anything," the woman said. "We're here for you." Inside the courthouse, Michael was waiting. When Frank walked in, Michael greeted him with a firm handshake. "You see those people outside?" Michael asked, nodding toward the group. Frank nodded, still bewildered. "Yeah, what's going on?" Michael smiled. "People care, Frank. Your story's out there now, and they want to make sure you're heard." Frank frowned. "I didn't ask for any of this." "I know," Michael said gently, "but maybe it's time someone stood up for you, don't you think?" Frank didn't respond. He wasn't sure how to process the idea that strangers, people who didn't know him, were fighting for him. Meanwhile, Sarah was visiting shelters and soup kitchens, asking if anyone had seen Frank. At one shelter, a volunteer recognized his description. "Yeah, Frank stays here sometimes," the man said. "Quiet guy. Keeps to himself. He might be at the courthouse right now. Something about a trespassing charge." Sarah thanked him and hurried off, her determination growing. As the day went on, the momentum behind Frank's story continued to build. News stations picked up the video, veterans groups began organizing, and social media campaigns demanded justice. Hashtag Help Frank Henderson started trending on Twitter, with users sharing their own stories of homeless veterans and calling for systemic change. Frank's life, once marked by quiet suffering, was now at the center of a national conversation. But for Frank, it was all a storm he didn't know how to weather. Sitting on a bench outside the courthouse, he clutched the folded flag in his hands. It was the one thing he had kept from his time in Vietnam, a reminder of the man he used to be. "All this attention," he muttered to himself. "What does it even mean?" He didn't know it yet, but the world was about to answer that question for him. One was from a local veterans advocacy group, offering to provide housing assistance for Frank. Another was from a prominent lawyer volunteering to help with the case. And yet another was from a retired judge, offering advice on how to frame Frank's defense in a way that could bring attention to broader systemic issues. Michael leaned back in his chair, overwhelmed but invigorated. For the first time, he felt like they had a real chance, not just to win the case, but to make a difference. Back at the shelter that evening, Frank sat at a small table, sipping a bowl of watery soup. The day had been long, and he was still processing everything that had happened. Sarah's words lingered in his mind, as did the sight of the people chanting outside the courthouse. It all felt surreal, like watching someone else's life unfold. "Hey, Frank," a voice called from across the room. It was one of the other shelter residents, a younger man named Ricky who had served in Iraq. "Saw you on TV, man. You're famous now." Frank chuckled dryly. "Famous? Great. Just what I needed." Ricky sat down across from him, his expression serious. "No, I mean it. What you're doing, it's important. People are paying attention because of you. Maybe things will change." Frank frowned, stirring his soup. "I'm not doing anything. It's just a bunch of noise." "Maybe," Ricky said, "but noise can turn into action. You'll see." As night fell, Frank lay on his cot, staring at the ceiling. For years, he had felt invisible, forgotten by the world. Now, he was at the center of something he didn't fully understand. People were calling him a hero, a victim, a symbol. But who was he, really? In the darkness, Frank pulled the photograph of Emily from his pocket. Her smiling face was a reminder of the life he had lost, the life he had failed to rebuild. For the first time in years, he whispered her name aloud. Emily. Somewhere, deep inside him, a spark of hope flickered to life. Maybe, just maybe, this storm of attention could lead to something better. Not just for him, but for the countless others who had been left behind. Tomorrow would bring more questions, more challenges, and more noise. But for the first time in a long time, Frank was beginning to wonder if noise was exactly what the world needed. The next day began like many others for Frank, early and cold. Yet, as he shuffled down the street toward the courthouse, he noticed something unusual. People nodding at him, offering him smiles, even small waves. A barista in a coffee shop pressed a steaming cup into his hands without asking for payment. "You take care of yourself, Mr. Henderson," she said kindly. Frank muttered a quiet "thank you," unsure how to respond to the sudden kindness. He wasn't used to it. Across town, Sarah was busy chasing down leads for a deeper story on Frank. She had been in touch with Thomas, the man who had emailed her claiming to have served with Frank in Vietnam. He had agreed to meet her at a diner that afternoon, and Sarah arrived early, her notepad and recorder ready. When Thomas arrived, Sarah was struck by his military bearing. His back was straight, his handshake firm, his eyes sharp. But there was also a heaviness in his demeanor, the weight of memories he hadn't fully let go of. "So, you knew Frank in Vietnam?" Sarah asked as they sat across from each other in a red vinyl booth. Thomas nodded, his expression softening. "Yeah, we were in the same unit. Frank was one of the best medics we had. The guy saved more lives than I can count." Sarah leaned forward, her pen poised. "What kind of man was he back then?" Thomas smiled faintly. "Quiet, but dependable. Everyone liked him. He had this way of keeping calm under pressure. It didn't matter how bad things got. Frank was always there, doing what needed to be done." Sarah hesitated. "What do you think happened to him? How did he end up like this?" Thomas sighed, leaning back in his seat. "War changes people. Frank came back different, like a lot of us did. But he had it worse. He lost his wife not long after we got home. I think that broke something in him." Sarah's heart sank. "His wife?" "Yeah, Carol. Sweet woman. She passed away in a car accident. After that, Frank just drifted. I tried to stay in touch, but he pulled away. And then, one day, he was just gone." Thomas's voice grew quieter. "I always wondered if I could have done more for him. Maybe I should have tried harder." Sarah shook her head. "You can't blame yourself. The system failed him, like it's failed so many others." Thomas looked at her, his jaw tightening. Maybe. But Frank isn't just some sad story. He's a fighter. If anyone deserves a second chance, it's him. At the courthouse, Michael was hard at work preparing for Frank's trial, now just days away. The attention the case had garnered brought pressure, but also opportunity. He had spent the morning meeting with a representative from a national veterans advocacy group that wanted to support Frank's defense. The prosecution's argument is flimsy, the representative said. They're treating Frank like a nuisance when they should be asking why a man like him doesn't have access to housing or proper care. Michael nodded. That's exactly the angle I want to take. This isn't just about Frank, it's about the bigger picture. The representative handed Michael a folder. Here's some data on homeless veterans in this state. Use it. If you can make the jury see the broader issue, they'll think twice before convicting him. Michael thanked her, feeling more determined than ever. Later that evening, Sarah managed to track Frank down at the shelter. She approached him cautiously, unsure if he would welcome her intrusion. "Frank," she said, sitting down beside him at a worn plastic table. "I spoke with Thomas today." Frank's hand froze halfway to his mouth, the spoon in his fingers trembling slightly. He set it down and looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Thomas," he repeated. "He told me about Vietnam," Sarah said gently. "About the lives you saved. About Carol." Frank's face darkened, and he looked away. "That was a long time ago. But it's still part of who you are," Sarah said. "People need to know the whole story, Frank. Not just what happened to you now, but who you've always been." Frank shook his head. "What good's it gonna do? None of that changes where I am now." "It might," Sarah pressed. "People are listening, Frank. They care. And if you let them see the man behind the headlines, maybe they'll care even more." Frank didn't respond right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't want their pity." "It's not pity," Sarah said. "It's respect, and it's long overdue." For a long moment, they sat in silence. Finally, Frank nodded, though he still looked uncertain. "Fine," he said. "You want to tell my story? I'll tell you what you want to know. But don't make me out to be some kind of saint. I've made my share of mistakes." Sarah smiled, her chest tight with emotion. "Everyone has, Frank. That's what makes your story real." As Sarah began documenting Frank's past, and Michael continued building his case, the wheels of change were slowly beginning to turn. Frank's story was no longer just about one man. It had become a rallying cry for those who had been forgotten, a testament to resilience, and a plea for justice. But with the trial looming, Frank couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest battles were still ahead. The morning of the trial dawned cold and gray, the kind of weather that seeped into your bones and made the day feel heavier. Frank stood outside the courthouse, clutching his jacket tightly around him as he stared at the growing crowd of supporters. There were veterans in uniform, holding flags and saluting him as he passed. Students waved handmade signs with slogans like "Justice for Frank" and "No Veteran Left Behind." A few television cameras had been set up on the courthouse steps, reporters speaking animatedly into microphones as they covered the case. Frank felt out of place in the midst of it all. He wasn't used to being noticed, let alone celebrated. For decades, he'd been invisible, a ghost of the man he once was. Now, he felt like a reluctant participant in a drama he hadn't asked for. Michael approached him, dressed sharply in a dark suit, his briefcase in hand. "You ready?" he asked, his voice calm but encouraging. Frank shrugged. "Don't have much choice, do I?" Michael smiled faintly. "You've got this. Just tell the truth. I'll handle the rest." Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense but quiet. The gallery was packed with supporters, journalists, and curious onlookers who had come to see the case unfold. Frank sat at the defense table, his shoulders hunched, feeling every pair of eyes on him. The prosecutor, a polished woman named Linda Whitaker, stood at the opposite table. She was confident, efficient, and clearly determined to prove her case. As the judge entered the room and called the court to order, Michael leaned over to Frank. "Remember, this isn't just about the charges. It's about showing the jury and the world who you are." Frank nodded, though his stomach churned with nerves. Linda opened her case with a clear and measured argument. "This case is simple," she said, addressing the jury. The defendant, Mr. Henderson, knowingly trespassed on private property. The law is clear, and it must be upheld. She presented security footage of Frank entering the abandoned warehouse, along with the police report from his arrest. The evidence was straightforward, leaving little room for doubt about what had happened. But when Michael rose to deliver his opening statement, he took a different approach. "Yes, my client entered that warehouse," Michael began, his voice steady. "And yes, by the letter of the law, that constitutes trespassing. But this case isn't as simple as the prosecution would have you believe." He paused, looking directly at the jury. Frank Henderson is a 76-year-old Vietnam veteran. He served his country with honor, saving countless lives as a medic. He came home to a nation that turned its back on him, leaving him to struggle with loss, trauma, and poverty. The real question here isn't whether he trespassed. It's why a man who gave so much was forced into that situation to begin with. The gallery murmured in agreement, and Michael pressed on. This trial isn't just about Frank. It's about all the men and women who have been left behind by a system that should have protected them. I ask you to look beyond the technicalities of the law and see the humanity of the man before you. Frank glanced at Michael, a flicker of gratitude in his eyes. The first witnesses called by the prosecution were the arresting officers. They described finding Frank in the warehouse, disheveled and carrying only a worn backpack. Did he resist arrest? Michael asked during cross-examination. No, one officer admitted. He came quietly. Did he harm anyone or cause damage to the property? The officer shook his head. No, sir. Michael nodded, letting the jury absorb the officer's words. When it was Michael's turn to present the defense, he called Sarah as his first witness. She walked to the stand, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her expression resolute. "Sarah, you're the one who recorded the video of Mr. Henderson's arrest, correct?" Michael asked. "Yes," she said. "Why did you feel compelled to share it?" Sarah took a deep breath. "Because it broke my heart. Here was this elderly man, a veteran, being treated like a criminal for simply trying to survive. I wanted people to see what I saw, that this isn't right." Michael nodded. "What kind of response did the video receive?" "It went viral," Sarah said. "People were outraged. They couldn't believe a man like Frank could be left in this position. It sparked conversations about how we treat our veterans and the homeless." Next, Michael called Thomas to the stand. The former soldier's presence commanded respect, and the courtroom fell silent as he began to speak. "I served with Frank in Vietnam," Thomas said. "He was the best medic we had. He saved my life and the lives of countless others. When we came home, we were all struggling. But Frank, he lost everything. His wife, his stability, and no one was there to help him pick up the pieces." Thomas's voice cracked as he continued. "Frank isn't a criminal. He's a hero, and it's about time someone treated him like one." When Frank finally took the stand, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his hands gripping the edges of the witness box. "Mr. Henderson," Michael began, "why were you in that warehouse?" Frank cleared his throat. "I was cold. It was late, and I didn't have anywhere else to go." "Did you know it was private property?" "Yeah," Frank admitted, "but I didn't think anyone would care. It's not like anyone was using it." Michael nodded. "Frank, can you tell the court about your life since coming back from Vietnam?" Frank hesitated, his voice thick with emotion. I came back different. Lost my wife in a car crash a few years later. After that, things just fell apart. I tried to keep going, but it wasn't enough." He looked down, his voice barely audible. "I never wanted to be a burden. I just didn't know where else to turn." As the first day of the trial came to a close, Frank felt both exhausted and strangely lighter. For the first time in years, his story had been heard. Outside the courthouse, the crowd of supporters erupted into cheers as Frank and Michael emerged. Frank still felt uncomfortable with the attention, but there was a small part of him that was beginning to believe Sarah and Michael were right, that his life, his story, could make a difference. But the battle wasn't over yet. The prosecution had more evidence to present, and the jury's decision remained uncertain. Frank braced himself for what was still to come, knowing that the hardest fight was yet ahead. The second day of the trial began under a stormy sky. Rain splattered against the courthouse windows, mirroring the tension inside as the prosecution prepared to dig deeper into their case. Frank sat at the defense table, his shoulders hunched, bracing for the storm he felt coming. Linda Whitaker rose from her seat, her posture confident and her tone sharp. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I'd like to remind you that this case is not about pity or emotions. It's about the law, and the law was broken." She moved toward the jury box, her heels clicking against the polished floor. "While I respect Mr. Henderson's service and his struggles, we cannot allow emotions to cloud our judgment. The defendant knowingly trespassed on private property. This isn't a moral debate, it's a legal one." The jury shifted slightly, their expressions a mix of sympathy and thoughtfulness. Linda began calling her own witnesses, starting with the property owner whose warehouse Frank had entered. "Mr. Clark," Linda began, "can you describe the state of your property when the defendant was discovered there?" Clark, a well-dressed man in his 50s, adjusted his tie before speaking. "The warehouse has been vacant for years, but I keep it locked and secured. When I found out someone had broken in, I was concerned about vandalism or damage." "Did Mr. Henderson cause any damage?" Linda asked. "No," Clark admitted, though his tone was grudging. "But that's not the point. It's my property. He had no right to be there." Linda nodded, satisfied. "Thank you, Mr. Clark. No further questions." When Michael rose to cross-examine, his approach was more measured. "Mr. Clark," Michael began, "you mentioned the warehouse has been vacant for years. Is that correct?" "Yes," Clark replied. "And during that time, have you used it for any purpose?" Clark hesitated. "No." "So, would you agree that Mr. Henderson's presence didn't prevent you from using the property?" Clark frowned. "I suppose not, but—" Michael cut in gently. "One last question, Mr. Clark. Were you aware of the weather conditions on the night Mr. Henderson was found in your warehouse?" Clark shifted uncomfortably. "It was cold. Freezing, actually," Michael said, his voice firm. "Thank you, Mr. Clark. No further questions." Next, Linda attempted to paint Frank as a chronic trespasser, presenting records of previous incidents where he had been found sleeping in parks, on benches, or in abandoned buildings. "Your Honor," Linda said, turning toward the judge, "these incidents demonstrate a clear pattern of disregard for the law." Michael immediately stood. "Objection, Your Honor. These incidents are unrelated to the case at hand and do nothing but prejudice the jury against my client." The judge nodded. Sustained. The jury is instructed to disregard this line of questioning. Frank exhaled quietly, relief washing over him. During a brief recess, Sarah caught up with Michael in the hallway. "They're trying to bury him with technicalities," she said, her frustration evident. Michael nodded grimly. "It's their only real strategy. They can't argue morality, so they're clinging to the letter of the law. How do we fight that?" Sarah asked. Michael gave her a small, determined smile. "By showing the jury that sometimes the law isn't enough. They need to see the bigger picture." When the court reconvened, Michael called his next witness, Dr. Elaine Porter, a psychologist specializing in PTSD and veteran mental health. "Dr. Porter," Michael began, "can you explain the long-term effects of combat-related trauma on veterans like Mr. Henderson?" Dr. Porter nodded. "Of course. Veterans who experience prolonged exposure to combat often suffer from PTSD, which can lead to depression, anxiety, and difficulty reintegrating into civilian life. These challenges are compounded when veterans lack access to adequate support systems. Would you say these factors contributed to Mr. Henderson's current situation?" "Absolutely," Dr. Porter replied. "Based on my review of his case, it's clear that Mr. Henderson's struggles are directly linked to his experiences in Vietnam and the lack of resources available to him upon his return." Michael turned to the jury. "So, in your professional opinion, Mr. Henderson's actions were not born of malice or criminal intent, but rather of necessity and survival?" "That's correct," Dr. Porter affirmed. Linda attempted to discredit Dr. Porter during cross-examination, but the psychologist held firm, her calm and authoritative demeanor making a strong impression on the jury. As the day wore on, Michael felt the tide beginning to shift. The jury seemed more engaged, their expressions softening as they listened to the defense's arguments. But Linda wasn't done. She called a final witness, a former city official who testified about the dangers of allowing trespassing to go unchecked. If we allow exceptions for one person, the official said, it sets a precedent that undermines property rights for everyone. It was a strong point, one that Michael knew he would have to counter carefully in his closing arguments. As court adjourned for the day, Frank felt drained. He shuffled out of the courthouse, avoiding the cameras and reporters waiting on the steps. Sarah caught up with him, walking by his side. "You held up well today," she said. Frank grunted in response, his hands stuffed deep into his pockets. "Do you think it's enough?" he asked after a long silence. Sarah hesitated. "I don't know, but I think people are starting to see the truth. That has to count for something." Frank nodded, though his expression remained uncertain. That night, Michael worked late, refining his strategy for the final days of the trial. He knew the prosecution would continue to hammer away at the technicalities of the law, but he also knew that the heart of this case, the reason it had captured so much attention, wasn't about trespassing. It was about justice, and Michael was determined to make sure the jury saw that before the trial was over. The third day of the trial began with an air of anticipation. By now, the courtroom wasn't just a place of legal proceedings. It had become a battleground for ideals. Supporters of Frank lined the streets outside, their signs more passionate than ever, while others tuned in from afar, following every development on the news. Inside, Frank sat silently, his hands clasped together, a quiet resilience emanating from him. Michael leaned over and gave him a reassuring nod. Today was critical. Linda Whitaker, the prosecutor, opened the day with a carefully planned attack, calling an economist as her witness to discuss the importance of property rights and their role in a functioning society. "Mr. Donnelly," Linda began, addressing the economist, "can you explain why property laws are essential for maintaining order in a community?" Donnelly adjusted his glasses and spoke with the measured tone of an academic. "Property rights are the foundation of our economy and social order. They ensure that individuals and businesses can operate without fear of intrusion or theft. If we allow exceptions, even for sympathetic cases, we risk eroding that foundation." Linda nodded, turning to the jury. "And what would happen if we allowed exceptions to these laws?" Donnelly frowned. "It could lead to chaos. People might begin to disregard boundaries, assuming they can act without consequence. It would undermine trust and security in our society." "Thank you, Mr. Donnelly," Linda said, her tone firm. "No further questions." When Michael rose for his cross-examination, his demeanor was calm but pointed. "Mr. Donnelly," he began, "I appreciate your expertise. But let me ask you this. Do you believe laws should be applied without any consideration of context or circumstances?" Donnelly hesitated. "The law is meant to be consistent, but there are rare exceptions where context matters." Michael seized on the admission. "Exactly. Context matters. Would you agree that someone seeking shelter from freezing temperatures isn't acting with malicious intent?" Donnelly shifted uncomfortably. "I suppose not, but—" Michael pressed on. "And would you also agree that the purpose of laws is to serve justice, not just to enforce rules blindly?" Donnelly exhaled, clearly frustrated. "In principle, yes." Michael stepped back, his tone softening. "Thank you, Mr. Donnelly. No further questions." As the trial progressed, Linda continued to hammer home her argument. Frank had broken the law, and that fact alone should decide the case. But Michael wasn't done. His next move was bold. He called a representative from a local veterans advocacy group to the stand. "Ms. Morales," Michael began, "can you tell us about the challenges faced by homeless veterans in our country?" Morales, a middle-aged woman with a determined expression, nodded. "Homeless veterans are among the most vulnerable members of our society. Many struggle with PTSD, physical disabilities, and a lack of support systems. Despite their service, they're often overlooked and left to fend for themselves." Michael leaned closer. "And how does the community typically respond to these individuals?" Morales's voice grew firm. "Too often, they're criminalized for simply trying to survive. Instead of receiving the help they need, they're treated as nuisances or criminals." "Thank you, Ms. Morales," Michael said, his voice resonating with sincerity. No further questions. The emotional peak of the day came when Michael called Frank's daughter, Rachel, to the stand. Her appearance had been a surprise, orchestrated by Michael to add an emotional weight to the defense. Rachel, a woman in her late 30s, looked nervous but resolute as she took her seat. Frank's eyes widened in shock, and he visibly stiffened at the sight of her. Rachel, Michael began gently, can you tell the court about your relationship with your father? Rachel hesitated, glancing briefly at Frank. It's complicated. We lost touch a long time ago. After my mom died, things were never the same. My dad fell apart, and I didn't know how to help him. Michael nodded. Did you ever try to reconnect? Tears welled in Rachel's eyes. I did, but he wouldn't let me. He didn't want me to see him struggling. He thought he was protecting me. Michael gave her a moment before continuing. Rachel, why did you agree to testify today? She took a deep breath, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. Because my dad doesn't deserve this. He's not a criminal. He's a good man who lost his way. And I think it's time the world saw that. Frank's hands trembled slightly as he listened, his gaze fixed on his daughter. As court adjourned for the day, the tension in the room was palpable. Outside, reporters speculated about how the emotional testimonies might influence the jury. Frank, however, was quiet as he walked out of the courthouse. He stopped just outside the doors, looking up at the gray sky. Sarah approached him cautiously, Rachel at her side. Hey, Sarah said softly. You okay? Frank nodded, though his expression was unreadable. His gaze shifted to Rachel, who looked at him with a mixture of hope and apprehension. I didn't know you'd be here, he said finally, his voice rough. Rachel smiled faintly. Michael thought it might help. I wanted to help. For a moment, they stood in silence, the years of distance between them heavy but not insurmountable. Thank you, Frank said at last, his voice barely audible. Rachel stepped closer, her hand brushing against his. I'm here now, Dad. Whatever happens, I'm here. Frank nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. That night, Michael stayed up late again, reviewing his notes and preparing for his closing argument. The prosecution had done a good job of presenting the legal framework, but Michael was counting on the jury to see beyond the law and into the heart of the matter. This case wasn't just about trespassing. It was about a man's dignity, his sacrifices, and the society that had failed him. Tomorrow would be their last chance to make that case. Michael was determined to make it count. The final day of the trial arrived, and the courtroom was filled with an electric sense of anticipation. The jury had heard the facts, the testimonies, and the emotional appeals from both sides. Now, it was time for the closing arguments, the last chance for both the defense and prosecution to sway the jury's decision. Frank sat quietly, his hands folded in front of him. His daughter Rachel sat beside him, her presence providing a sense of comfort amid the storm of uncertainty. He looked around the courtroom, the familiar faces of the legal team and the watching public, feeling the weight of the moment press down on him. Today, everything would be decided. Linda Whitaker, the prosecutor, rose first to deliver her closing argument. Her voice was calm, authoritative, yet there was an edge to it. Her desire to secure a conviction was clear. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Linda began, pacing slowly in front of them. This case is about the law. The law is clear, and it cannot be bent to fit anyone's personal circumstances, no matter how tragic they may be. She paused, making eye contact with each juror, one by one. Mr. Henderson broke the law by trespassing on private property. The owner had every right to press charges. And while you may feel sympathy for his plight as a homeless veteran, that sympathy does not change the fact that he violated the rules we all live by. Linda's tone grew more pointed. If we let people off the hook because of their past, their struggles, or their misfortunes, what does that say about our society? We must maintain the integrity of the law. We cannot afford to let emotions cloud our judgment. She took a step back, allowing her words to settle. I ask you, members of the jury, to follow the law, convict the defendant, and send a message that we will not allow our rules to be ignored, no matter the circumstances. With that, Linda sat down, her eyes fixed on the jury, awaiting their decision. Michael stood up slowly, taking a moment to gather his thoughts. The room was still, every eye on him as he made his way to the front. He had the opportunity now to offer the final defense for his client, and he knew it would be a battle of heart and mind. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Michael began, his voice calm but firm. "I stand before you today not to ask for leniency, but for understanding. Mr. Henderson, my client, is not a criminal. He is a man who served his country, a man who fought in a war that left invisible scars. He is a man who has faced more hardship than most of us could ever imagine. And now he faces a legal system that treats him as though he were no different from a common trespasser." Michael paused, letting the gravity of his words sink in. He turned toward Frank, who sat with his head slightly bowed. Frank Henderson did not enter that warehouse with criminal intent. He did not steal, damage, or harm anyone. He simply sought shelter from the elements, shelter that was sorely lacking in his life, despite his service to this country. He stepped forward, addressing the jury directly. Yes, Mr. Henderson trespassed, but in doing so, he was not committing a crime born of malice. He was acting out of survival. He was acting as any of us would act if we were faced with a bitter cold night, nowhere to go, no one to turn to. Michael's voice grew stronger. "The real question before you today is not about whether Mr. Henderson broke the law. The question is whether the law should be applied without regard for context, for humanity. Should we be a society that judges people based on technicalities alone, or should we be a society that sees the bigger picture?" He paused again, allowing the jury to reflect. Mr. Henderson served this country. He sacrificed more than most of us will ever know. And in return, he was left to fend for himself on the streets, without the help or support that he so desperately needed. Is this the way we should treat our veterans? Is this the message we want to send about how we care for those who have given everything for us? Michael turned back to Frank, who still sat silently, but now his posture was a little straighter. Mr. Henderson's case is not just a legal matter. It is a moral one. And I urge you, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, to look beyond the letter of the law and consider the spirit of justice. Consider the human being behind the charges, and make your decision with compassion, with understanding, and with the recognition that sometimes the law must bend to meet the needs of a broken society. He took a step back, his voice quiet but resolute. "Thank you." The room was silent as Michael returned to his seat. The jury sat motionless, deep in thought. Frank's heart pounded in his chest, the weight of the past few days heavy on his mind. His life, his future, and the respect he had longed for were now in the hands of 12 strangers. The judge rose from his seat, signaling the jury to begin deliberations. The tension was palpable as the courtroom emptied, the air thick with anticipation. Frank sat with Rachel, his fingers twitching in his lap, unsure of what to say. She squeezed his hand gently, offering him a quiet comfort. "Whatever happens," Rachel said softly, "I'm proud of you, Dad. You stood up, and you gave them your truth." Frank nodded, though the uncertainty still gnawed at him. "I just hope they see it. I hope they understand." Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the streets wet but calm. The clouds had parted, and for the first time in days, the sun peeked through, casting a soft glow over the courthouse. It was as though the world itself was waiting for the verdict. Hours passed as the jury deliberated, the courthouse a place of nervous energy. The reporters gathered in small clusters, speculating on the outcome. The defense team stood by, offering little more than hopeful glances toward one another. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the jury returned. The room fell silent once more as the judge prepared to announce the verdict. The moment of truth had arrived. The courtroom was filled with an almost suffocating silence as the judge, Judge Carter, rose from his seat. His gavel rested in his hand, and the air was thick with anticipation. Frank, Rachel, Michael, Linda, and the entire room waited in tension-filled silence. It felt like time had slowed down, each passing second stretching into eternity. Judge Carter turned toward the jury, his expression serious but unreadable. He waited a moment longer, allowing the last traces of silence to settle before he spoke. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice steady and calm, "have you reached a verdict?" The jury foreman, a middle-aged man in a suit, stood and nodded. He glanced toward the judge and then toward the audience, his gaze lingering for a moment on Frank. "We have, Your Honor," the foreman said. The judge nodded. "Please, read the verdict." The foreman cleared his throat and slowly began to speak, his voice echoing through the courtroom. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Frank Henderson, not guilty of trespassing." The words hung in the air, almost too incredible to believe. For a moment, the room was completely still, as if no one dared to breathe. Frank's heart skipped a beat. His hands shook, and he couldn't quite process what he had just heard. Rachel's face was a mixture of disbelief and relief. She turned to look at her father, whose eyes were wide, his face pale as he tried to absorb the weight of the words. Slowly, a smile began to form on his lips, though it was small and tentative. Michael's face broke into a smile, though it was tempered with the knowledge of how close they had come to losing. He stood up from his seat and walked over to Frank, offering him a handshake. Frank reached out, his hand trembling as he shook Michael's firmly. "I don't know what to say," Frank muttered, his voice rough with emotion. "You don't need to say anything," Michael replied, his voice warm and reassuring. "You just have to know that justice has been done." Linda Whitaker, standing on the opposite side of the courtroom, looked visibly shaken. Her mouth was set in a tight line, and her eyes flashed with a mixture of frustration and disbelief. She had worked hard to secure a conviction, but in the end, the jury had sided with the defense. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clipped, "we request that the defendant be remanded into custody for an appeal." Judge Carter looked at Linda, then at Frank, and finally back at the jury. "The jury's verdict stands," he said firmly. "The defendant is free to go. Court is adjourned." The gavel came down with a finality that echoed through the courtroom, and just like that, the trial was over. The room began to empty as people filed out, some whispering to each other, others shaking their heads in disbelief. For Frank, it felt as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The years of hardship, the struggle, the uncertainty, all of it had led to this moment. Rachel took his arm and gently guided him toward the door. "Dad, let's go home," she said softly, her voice full of emotion. Frank nodded, still in a daze. As they walked out of the courtroom, he glanced back once, his gaze lingering on the empty space behind him. Outside, the sun had broken through the clouds completely, casting a warm light over the courthouse steps. The crowd that had gathered outside to watch the trial's conclusion was now dispersing, murmuring among themselves. Some were reporters, others were supporters of Frank, and a few were simply curious onlookers. Frank and Rachel stepped into the sunlight, where the weight of the decision was beginning to sink in. Frank breathed deeply, feeling the fresh air fill his lungs. For the first time in a long while, he felt free. "I can't believe it," Frank whispered, his voice filled with awe. "I'm free." Rachel squeezed his hand. "You are, Dad. And you know what? This is just the beginning. We can start over. We can finally have a chance to put everything behind us." Frank looked at his daughter, his eyes softening. "I don't know what I would have done without you, Rachel." "Thank you." Rachel smiled, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I've always been here for you, Dad. I always will be." As they walked toward the car, Michael came out of the courthouse behind them. He caught up with them and gave Frank a pat on the back. "I'll let you two have your moment," he said, his voice warm but tinged with pride. "But I just want to say, I'm glad I could be part of this." Frank looked up at him, his expression grateful. "You saved me, Michael. You really did." Michael smiled. "It was your fight, Frank. I just helped you find your way back." As the three of them got into the car, the world outside seemed to be brighter, more full of possibility. Frank's mind raced as he thought about what he would do next. He didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in years, he felt like he had a chance to figure it out. The car pulled away from the courthouse, and as they drove through the streets, Frank glanced out the window. The city that had once seemed so cold and indifferent now felt full of potential. Maybe there was still a place for him in it after all. That night, Frank sat down in a small apartment that Rachel had helped him secure, the first real place he'd had to call his own in years. It was simple, but it was his. He stared out the window at the stars, his mind at peace for the first time in so long. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, he was content. He had his freedom, and with the support of his daughter and the people who believed in him, he was ready to start over. He wasn't sure where the road would take him, but he knew one thing. He wasn't walking it alone. As Frank reflected on everything that had brought him here, he knew that his journey wasn't just about the trial or the legal system or even the victory. It was about reclaiming his dignity, his sense of self, and the belief that no matter how hard life had been, there was always the possibility of a second chance. And that was something worth fighting for. The days following the trial were a whirlwind of change for Frank Henderson. He had been acquitted of trespassing, and while the legal battle was over, it felt like his real journey was just beginning. For the first time in a long while, Frank had a sense of hope, a feeling that his life could start to rebuild. Rachel had helped him secure a small apartment, a modest one-bedroom unit in a quiet part of town. It wasn't much, but it was his, and that made all the difference. The feeling of a roof over his head was something he hadn't taken for granted in years. He had a bed to sleep in, a place to keep his things, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he didn't have to worry about where he'd go when night fell. The apartment was sparsely furnished, just the essentials. Frank had a small couch, a table with a few chairs, and a bed in the corner. A couple of boxes were still stacked by the door, full of things he hadn't yet found the energy to unpack. The walls were bare, and the light from the window cast a soft glow on everything. It wasn't luxurious, but it was clean and quiet, and that was all he needed for now. Rachel had come by earlier in the day to help him get settled. She brought some groceries and even a few framed pictures of their family, placing them on the small table near the window. It wasn't much, but it was a start. "Do you need anything else?" she asked, standing in the doorway as Frank looked around. "I can pick up some more things for the place tomorrow if you want." Frank shook his head. "No, this is fine. I don't need much." Rachel smiled softly but still looked concerned. "I'm just glad you're here, Dad. You deserve this." Frank gave her a tired smile. "Thanks, Rachel. I don't know what I'd do without you." She walked over to him and hugged him tightly, the warmth of her embrace grounding him. "You've been through a lot, Dad. You've earned this new beginning, and I'm going to help you every step of the way." As the days passed, Frank started to get into a routine. The apartment became more like home, and he began to feel a sense of pride in his small but meaningful space. He spent his mornings sorting through the boxes and organizing what few possessions he had. He would take long walks around the neighborhood in the afternoons, just to clear his mind and get familiar with his surroundings. There were still many reminders of his old life, his time spent on the streets, but slowly, he was putting those memories in the past. He tried to focus on the present. Frank knew he couldn't waste time. He had been given a second chance, and he was determined to make the most of it. He began looking for work, taking small steps each day. The job market wasn't kind to people with his history. His time as a homeless veteran had left scars, both physical and emotional, but Frank wasn't discouraged. He had fought in wars, endured hardship, and survived the streets. If he could do that, he could handle anything. He applied to a local hardware store, figuring he could start with something simple, even if it wasn't glamorous. The manager, a man named Greg, seemed to appreciate Frank's honesty and resilience when he mentioned his past. Greg had a soft spot for veterans, and after a brief interview, he offered Frank a part-time position stocking shelves. It wasn't much, but it was a start, and Frank was grateful for it. A few weeks into his new job, Frank found himself feeling more grounded. He had a steady routine now: work during the day, sometime at night to unwind, and then a peaceful sleep in his own bed. He still struggled with memories of his time on the streets, the desperation he'd felt during those long, cold nights, but each day was a little easier. The support of Rachel and the sense of purpose that came from his work made the weight of his past seem just a little bit lighter. One evening, after a long day at the store, Frank sat on his couch, reflecting on how far he'd come. He'd made it through the trial, found a job, and was slowly but surely rebuilding his life. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace. He had a future. He thought back to the trial, to the moment when the jury had declared him not guilty. It had been an emotional roller coaster, and even now, The relief of that day still washed over him. But it wasn't just the verdict that had changed his life. It was the recognition that people, despite his past, still saw him as a man worth helping, worth believing in. And that was something he had never felt before. The next morning, Rachel came by for a visit, as she did every weekend. This time, she brought her 2 children with her, Frank's grandchildren, Emma and Noah. They were young, full of energy, and they lit up the apartment with their laughter. Rachel had always kept in touch with Frank, but this felt different. It felt like a real family visit, not just a daughter helping her father through a tough time. "Grandpa, look," Emma said excitedly, holding up a drawing she had made. It was a picture of a house, with a big sun shining over it. "This is your new home, right?" Frank smiled, his heart swelling with love. "It sure is, sweetheart. It sure is." The small moments, the simple things like this, were what Frank cherished most now. The noise, the joy, the feeling of being loved. It all felt like a dream come true after so many years of hardship. Rachel sat down next to Frank, looking at the drawing. "I think they like it here," she said with a grin. Frank chuckled. "I think I do too." Life wasn't perfect, but Frank had finally started to feel like he was on the right track. The road ahead would still be tough. There would be days when the weight of his past threatened to drag him down, and times when he doubted himself. But for the first time in years, he felt that there was something worth fighting for, something that mattered more than just survival. He wasn't just a homeless veteran anymore. He was Frank Henderson, a man who had been through the worst and come out the other side. A man who had a family, a job, and a future. And that was all he needed. As Frank looked around the apartment, now more lived in and full of life, he realized that it wasn't just the roof over his head that mattered. It was the people who filled his life with meaning, the ones who believed in him when he could barely believe in himself. For the first time, Frank felt like he was truly home. Months passed, and Frank's life slowly began to stabilize. The part-time job at the hardware store turned into full-time work, as Greg, the manager, had taken a liking to Frank's work ethic and resilience. Frank's confidence grew as he excelled in his role. The physical work of stocking shelves and helping customers wasn't glamorous, but it gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Rachel continued to be his anchor. She visited regularly, always offering encouragement and support. Sometimes she brought the kids, who had quickly become attached to their grandfather. Frank enjoyed their visits, their laughter, and the simple joy of watching them grow. It wasn't a perfect life, but it was his life, and for the first time in a long while, it felt like something worth holding on to. One evening, after a long shift, Frank sat on the small balcony of his apartment, a cup of coffee in his hands. He stared out at the city skyline, the lights twinkling in the distance. It was a peaceful night, the kind that made him reflect on how far he had come. It wasn't always easy to shake off the memories of the years he'd spent on the streets, but they were slowly fading, replaced by the small victories of his daily life. Frank thought back to his time in the military, the chaos, the fear, and the overwhelming sense of loss he had felt during and after the war. The war had left scars, physical ones and mental ones that still haunted him, even now. He had been discharged with nothing, left to fend for himself on the streets. But the journey from there to here had been nothing short of a miracle, and he knew that it hadn't been just luck. It had been the support of people who cared, like Rachel, like Michael, like Greg. It had been the determination to keep going, even when everything seemed impossible. It was a quiet Wednesday when Frank got a call that would change his life yet again. He was at work, arranging boxes of paint on the shelves when his phone buzzed in his pocket. "Hello?" he answered, wiping his hands on his apron. "Mr. Henderson?" A voice on the other end asked. "This is Sarah Mitchell from the local Veterans Association. How are you today?" Frank raised an eyebrow, unsure of what the call could be about. "I'm doing well, thank you. How can I help you?" "I've been reviewing your case," Sarah continued, "and we've been following up on some programs that might be of assistance. We have a new initiative for homeless veterans who have successfully transitioned into stable housing and employment. Given your situation, we think you might be eligible for some benefits and services to help you continue your progress." Frank's heart skipped a beat. He had heard of programs like this before, but he had never thought he'd be able to qualify. He had been on his own for so long that the idea of asking for help felt foreign. "That sounds interesting," Frank replied, cautious but intrigued. Sarah continued, "We offer a variety of support services, including financial assistance, housing support, career development programs, and therapy for veterans. We want to help you build a sustainable future. Would you be interested in learning more?" Frank paused, considering her words. For a moment, he felt a flicker of doubt. He had come so far on his own, with Rachel's help, and the idea of accepting more assistance was both humbling and comforting at the same time. Finally, he made up his mind. "Yes, I'd be interested," he said, his voice steady but filled with hope. "I could use some help." Over the next few weeks, Frank met with Sarah several times. He learned more about the program and its offerings. The Veterans Association was not just about financial aid. It was about building a foundation for long-term success. Frank was assigned a caseworker who helped him apply for grants that would assist with rent, job training, and mental health support. They also connected him with a therapist who specialized in PTSD and trauma counseling. The therapy was a challenge at first. Frank had spent years hiding his emotions, burying his pain deep inside. The thought of opening up to a stranger was intimidating, but he knew he had to try. The nightmares, the flashbacks, and the anxiety were still a part of his life. He needed to confront them before they consumed him again. As the weeks went on, Frank found himself gradually becoming more comfortable in therapy. He began to understand the root of his struggles, the trauma he had endured during the war and the years of homelessness that had followed. He learned how to manage the stress and anxiety that had once overwhelmed him. Rachel noticed the change in her father. At first, she had been concerned about the impact of therapy, worried that the memories would be too painful for him to face. But over time, she saw him becoming more grounded, more at peace with himself. He had his ups and downs, of course, but he was no longer the broken man she had once feared he would be. "You're doing great, Dad," she told him one evening as they sat on the couch in his apartment. "I can see the difference. You're not the same person you were when you first got out of the shelter. I'm so proud of you." Frank smiled, his eyes softening. "I wouldn't be here without you, Rachel. You've always been my rock." She took his hand and squeezed it gently. "And you've always been mine, Dad. We're in this together." Frank's progress was slow but steady. The combination of his job at the hardware store, the support from the Veterans Association, and the love from his family gave him the strength to keep moving forward. He started to set new goals for himself. He dreamed of getting his own car, of taking a vacation with Rachel and the kids, of finding ways to help other veterans who were struggling like he had. One evening, after finishing another shift at the store, Frank sat in his apartment and thought about the future. He didn't know what it held, but he felt more confident than he had in years. He knew that, with the right support and the strength to keep going, he could build the life he had always wanted. It wasn't going to be easy, but Frank was ready for whatever came next. As Frank stood at the window, watching the sun set over the city, he felt a quiet sense of peace. The road to redemption was long, and it would never be without its challenges, but he was no longer walking it alone. For the first time in a long while, Frank Henderson was beginning to believe in the possibility of a new life. The quiet rhythm of Frank's life was interrupted one chilly evening in early winter. He had just finished a shift at the hardware store and was sitting in his small apartment, enjoying a rare moment of solitude. The holiday season was approaching, and he could feel a mix of emotions bubbling up inside him. The holidays had never been easy for Frank. Memories of his years in the military and on the streets often resurfaced during this time, reminding him of the family he had lost and the life he had left behind. But this year, things were different. Rachel had invited him to spend Christmas with her family. She insisted it would be good for him to be around the kids, to experience the joy of family during the season. Frank was hesitant at first. He didn't want to burden anyone with his presence, but eventually, he agreed. It would be nice to be surrounded by love, even if it wasn't something he was used to. As he sat in his apartment, his thoughts drifted back to the years spent on the streets. The cold, the hunger, the loneliness. All of it had become a distant memory, but it still haunted him from time to time. He shook off the thoughts, trying to focus on the present, on the life he had built. The gentle hum of the heater in the corner of the room was the only sound that filled the apartment. Just then, there was a knock at the door. Frank wasn't expecting anyone. He stood up cautiously, unsure of who it could be. His first instinct was to look through the peephole, just to be sure. To his surprise, standing outside was a man in his late 50s, dressed in a worn jacket with a military cap on his head. The man's face was weathered, his eyes tired but kind. Frank recognized the uniform. This was a fellow veteran, someone who had clearly seen his share of battles, both on and off the battlefield. Frank opened the door slowly. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice guarded. The man smiled faintly, though it was clear he wasn't entirely sure what to say next. "I'm sorry to disturb you, sir. My name's Tom. I used to serve in the same unit as you." Frank's heart skipped a beat. The name didn't ring a bell immediately, but it was possible they had crossed paths during his time in the military. The memories of those years were blurry, but the bond between soldiers was something Frank understood deeply. I don't remember you," Frank admitted, trying to be polite but feeling uncomfortable at the unexpected visit. "That's okay," Tom said quickly, as if anticipating Frank's reaction. "We didn't serve in the same platoon, but we were both stationed at the same base in the late 70s. I saw your name in a list of veterans from our unit. I've been trying to track you down for a while. I need your help." Frank frowned, confusion clouding his thoughts. "Help? What kind of help?" Tom took a deep breath, his eyes shifting uneasily. "I'm in a bit of a tough spot. I'm homeless again. I've been living on the streets for a while now, off and on. I heard about you, how you've turned things around, and I didn't know who else to turn to." Frank's heart sank as he listened to the man's story. It was a story he knew all too well, the same one he had lived for years. The struggle to survive, the endless cycle of despair, the feeling of being invisible. Frank had managed to pull himself out of that darkness, but here was someone who had clearly fallen into the same trap he had once been in. "I'm not sure I can help you," Frank said softly, but there was a tinge of guilt in his voice. He had worked so hard to rebuild his life, and the idea of reopening that chapter, of offering help, made him nervous. He was still finding his own footing. Tom seemed to understand. "I don't want to be a burden," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I just thought, maybe you'd know what to do. Maybe you could point me in the right direction." Frank hesitated. He knew the feeling all too well, the hopelessness, the feeling that no one cared, that no one would help. But Frank wasn't the same man he had been when he was out there. He had learned so much since then. He had people who cared about him now. And maybe, just maybe, he could make a difference for someone else. "Come inside," Frank said, surprising even himself with the words. "You can stay for a little while. We can talk." Tom's face lit up with relief. "Thank you," he said, stepping inside. "I swear, I didn't know where else to go." Over the next few hours, Frank listened as Tom shared his story. Tom had served in the same military unit as Frank, though their paths had rarely crossed. After their discharge, Tom had struggled to reintegrate into civilian life, eventually succumbing to alcohol and drug addiction. His time in the streets had been long and difficult, and he had lost touch with most of the people from his past. Frank didn't judge Tom for his struggles. He had been there, in the dark places, and he understood. He also knew that helping Tom wouldn't be easy. But Frank wasn't the same man he had been years ago. He had a support system now. He had Rachel, the Veterans Association, and a community of people who had helped him find his way back. Maybe it was time to pay that forward. "I can't promise you everything will be easy," Frank said after a long silence, "but I can help you find a place to stay. There's a shelter nearby that works with veterans. They might have a spot for you." Tom looked up at Frank, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "You'd really do that for me?" "I don't know if I can do it all, but I'll do what I can," Frank replied. "I know what it's like. You don't have to go through this alone." The next morning, Frank helped Tom gather his things and drove him to the veteran shelter that had helped him get back on his feet. The staff there welcomed Tom with open arms, and for the first time in a long time, Tom seemed to breathe a little easier. Frank didn't know if Tom would take the help and turn his life around like he had. But for the first time in a while, Frank felt a sense of peace. He had done something good. He had given back, not out of obligation, but because he knew how precious the chance to rebuild a life was. As Frank drove back to his apartment, He thought about his own journey. He had been through so much, but he had come out the other side. He was no longer lost. He had a family, a job, and a future. And now, maybe, just maybe, he was helping someone else find their way. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about redemption. Later that week, as the holiday season arrived, Frank found himself sitting down to Christmas dinner at Rachel's house. The kids were excited, running around in their new pajamas, and Rachel had made a big meal. Frank had never felt so much at home. It wasn't about the gifts or the food. It was about being together. And for the first time, Frank felt that warmth in his chest that he had been missing for so many years. He looked around the table at his family, at Rachel, at the kids, and at the life he had slowly but surely built. He had come a long way, and he was finally starting to feel like he truly belonged. The road to redemption wasn't over, but Frank knew one thing for sure. He was no longer walking it alone. The holiday season continued, and Frank found himself in a place he had never thought he would be, surrounded by laughter, warmth, and love. His first Christmas in years where he felt like part of something again, something bigger than just survival. Rachel's family had welcomed him with open arms, and it was clear they were all trying to make up for lost time. After dinner, as the kids played with their new toys and the adults relaxed by the fireplace, Frank slipped away for a moment of quiet. He stepped out onto the porch, his breath visible in the cold night air. The snow was just beginning to fall, blanketing the ground in a soft layer of white. Frank inhaled deeply, feeling the coolness in his lungs. It was peaceful. It was everything he had longed for. He leaned against the railing, taking in the moment. His life had changed so dramatically, from the dark days of homelessness to this, sharing Christmas with his daughter and her family. But there was still something gnawing at him. A quiet voice in the back of his mind reminding him that the road to healing was not a straight path. The next morning, Rachel invited Frank to spend the day with her and the kids. As they gathered around the breakfast table, Rachel's youngest daughter, Lily, looked up at Frank with a curious expression. "Grandpa, do you ever miss the army?" she asked innocently. Frank froze for a moment, the question catching him off guard. It was the first time anyone had brought up his past so directly in front of the kids. He had never been sure how to explain those years to them. How could he? How could he put into words the chaos, the fear, the memories that still haunted him? Rachel noticed his hesitation and stepped in, giving Frank a gentle nudge. "It's okay, honey. Grandpa's been through a lot, but he's here with us now, and we love him for it." Frank appreciated Rachel's attempt to shield him, but the question lingered in his mind. Did he miss the army? The answer was complicated. There were parts of his military life he would never forget, the camaraderie, the bond with his fellow soldiers. But there were also parts of it that haunted him, the things he had witnessed, the things he had done. Those memories were scars, still fresh even though the years had passed. He thought about his time in the service, about the way it had shaped him. He had learned discipline, resilience, and how to fight. But it had also shown him the worst of humanity, the cruelty of war. And when it was over, when he was left to fend for himself, it was as though all that training, all that strength, meant nothing. Frank sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I miss some parts of it, I guess. The brotherhood, the sense of purpose," he said, carefully choosing his words. "But it was also a tough time. A lot of things happened I don't like to remember." Lily nodded seriously, taking in Frank's words. She didn't fully understand, but she could tell it wasn't an easy subject for him. Later that afternoon, as Rachel and the kids went out to do some shopping, Frank found himself with some quiet time to reflect. He picked up the phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in years, the number of his old military buddy, Mike. Mike had been Frank's closest friend during their time in the service. After the war, their lives had gone in different directions. Mike had returned home to a family, while Frank had spiraled into homelessness. They had lost touch over the years, but Frank had always wondered what had happened to Mike. The phone rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered. "Hello? Mike? Is that you?" Frank's voice trembled slightly, a mixture of nerves and hope. "Frank?" Mike's voice cracked with surprise. "Is it really you?" Frank let out a shaky breath. "Yeah, it's me. Been a long time, huh? I thought you were." I thought you were gone, Mike said, his voice softening. Man, I've been trying to find you for years. Frank's heart skipped. I've been around, just not in the best places. But I'm getting my life back together now, Mike. I've got a job, a place to stay. That's great to hear, Frank. I'm glad you're doing better. Mike's voice was filled with relief. I've been meaning to get in touch. I didn't know if you'd be up for talking about the old days, but you've been on my mind. Frank felt a wave of emotion wash over him. He hadn't realized how much he missed hearing Mike's voice, how much he missed that bond they had shared during their time in the Army. I'd like to catch up, Mike, Frank said. Maybe we could meet up sometime soon. I could use a good conversation with an old friend. I'd like that, Frank, Mike replied. I'll give you a call when I'm in town. We can grab a beer and talk about everything. Frank smiled, feeling a sense of relief. It was the first step to reconnecting with a piece of his past, a part of him that he had tried to forget for so long. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something more. An opportunity to heal, to rebuild not just his life but the connections he had lost. That evening, after dinner with Rachel and the kids, Frank sat in his room and thought about the conversation with Mike. It wasn't just about finding an old friend. It was about finding the courage to face the past, to reconcile with it. Frank had spent so many years running from those memories, but now he felt ready to confront them. He didn't need to forget what had happened. He just needed to make peace with it. Rachel popped her head in, smiling. You okay, Dad? Frank nodded, his smile genuine. Yeah, I'm good. Just thinking about some things. She walked over and sat beside him. I'm proud of you, for everything you've been through and everything you've done to get here. I know it hasn't been easy. I'm proud of you too, Rachel, Frank said softly. You've helped me more than you know. She squeezed his hand. We're family, Dad. That's what family does. Frank felt a warmth in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. For so long, he had felt isolated, lost in a world where he didn't belong. But now, sitting here with his daughter, he realized something. He had a family again. He wasn't alone anymore. The road to redemption was long, and the journey was far from over. But for the first time, Frank felt hopeful. He had learned to trust again, to open up to those who cared about him. And maybe, just maybe, he was beginning to understand that redemption wasn't just about getting back on your feet. It was about finding the courage to reach out, to rebuild the ties that bind us to the people we love. As the evening drew to a close, Frank sat back and let himself feel the warmth of his family surrounding him. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew he was ready to face it, one day at a time. As the new year dawned, Frank's life seemed to be slowly but steadily falling into place. He had been sober for months, kept a steady job, and had begun to repair the fractured relationships in his life. But even as he embraced these positive changes, a shadow lingered, one he couldn't shake, no matter how hard he tried. His past. The nights were the hardest. Frank would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, his heart racing, his mind replaying scenes from the war. The firefights, the losses, the endless waiting, the haunting silence of death that followed each mission. No matter how many times he told himself it was over, that he had moved on, those memories refused to fade. Frank had never been one to talk about what he went through in the military. It was too painful, too raw. The few times he had tried to open up, the words had felt like jagged pieces of glass in his throat. The years on the streets had made it easier to bury the pain. But now, with his new life, it was coming to the surface again. He sat up in bed one quiet evening, the soft sound of his breathing filling the room. His mind raced, but it wasn't with thoughts of the future. It was filled with memories of the war, of the man he used to be, the man who had buried his emotions and allowed the world to pass him by, the man who had numbed his pain with alcohol and drifted from one day to the next. Frank rubbed his face and sighed. It felt as though the past had its grip on him once again, pulling him into the dark recesses of his mind. He had thought he was beyond it, but every time he closed his eyes, the memories came flooding back. The following day, Frank spent the afternoon walking through the park near his apartment, trying to clear his head. The trees were bare, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers against the gray sky. He watched as children played in the distance, their laughter carrying through the cold air. The simple joy they exuded felt foreign to him. It was hard for Frank to remember the last time he had truly laughed, truly felt lighthearted. But he had come a long way, and he wasn't ready to give up on that just yet. As he walked, he found himself at a small, unmarked bench overlooking the river. He sat down slowly, his body stiff from the cold. The river before him flowed steadily, its surface broken by occasional ripples. Frank let his gaze drift across the water, trying to still his racing thoughts. He hadn't expected to find peace by the river, but the sound of the water rushing past brought him a strange sense of calm. It was a reminder that life moved forward, whether we wanted it to or not. Beautiful, isn't it? Frank turned to see an older man standing beside the bench. The man had a kind smile, his eyes warm but tired, as if he too had seen more than his fair share of hardship. Frank nodded but didn't say anything. The man, sensing Frank's silence, sat down next to him. "I've been coming here for years," the man continued. "It's a good place to think, or not think, depending on how you're feeling." Frank finally spoke. "I used to come here a lot when I was younger. I'd come to clear my head, to escape the noise of everything around me." The older man turned to face Frank, his gaze piercing but understanding. "What are you escaping from?" Frank hesitated. The question hung in the air, heavy with the weight of truth. Could he say it aloud? Could he talk about the war, the pain, the guilt? Could he admit how much it still haunted him? "I'm not sure," Frank said after a moment, his voice barely a whisper. "I thought I had it all figured out. But some days it just feels like it's all still there. The past, the choices I made, the things I've done, they don't let me forget." The older man nodded, his expression gentle. "I understand. I've been there myself, son. I was a Marine back in the day. Saw things that still haunt me to this day." Frank looked at him, surprised. He hadn't expected to meet someone who could relate to the war, to the darkness he carried inside him. "You're not the only one who's felt that way," the man continued. "It's easy to think you're alone, that no one will understand. But you're not. A lot of us carry that weight. The key is learning how to live with it, not burying it, but accepting it." Frank's eyes met the man's, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe he didn't have to do this alone. Maybe he didn't have to carry the weight of the past forever. "Learning how to live with it," Frank repeated quietly. "I'm not sure I know how." The older man smiled softly. "None of us do at first. But you keep going. You keep showing up, even when it feels like everything is falling apart. And you learn to forgive yourself." Frank didn't respond right away. He let the words sink in. Forgive himself? He had never considered that before. How could he forgive himself for the things he had done, for the mistakes he had made? It didn't seem possible. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that maybe that was the missing piece. Forgiveness, not just from others, but from himself. If he was ever going to truly heal, he had to let go of the burden he had carried for so long. The man stood up slowly, ready to leave. "You're going to be all right, son. I can tell. Just take it one day at a time." Frank nodded, feeling a sense of gratitude he hadn't known he was capable of. "Thank you. I needed to hear that." The man gave him a nod of acknowledgement before walking away, leaving Frank with his thoughts. As Frank sat there, watching the river flow by, he realized that the past was never truly gone. It would always be a part of him. But maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to let it define him. It wasn't about forgetting. It was about learning to live with the weight and still finding the strength to move forward. As Frank walked back to his apartment, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had a long way to go, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was on the right path. Back at his apartment that evening, Frank took a deep breath and picked up the phone. He had been putting this off for months, but now he felt ready. He dialed Rachel's number. "Hey, Rachel," Frank said when she picked up. "I've been thinking a lot lately, and I think it's time we have a conversation. I want to be open with you about something." Rachel's voice was warm and reassuring. "Of course, Dad. What's on your mind?" Frank hesitated for a moment, then let out a breath. "I need to talk about the past, about what I've been carrying inside me." and I think it's time I start letting it go." Rachel didn't say anything right away, but Frank could hear her steadying her breath, ready to listen. For the first time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he was ready to face everything that had been holding him back. And with that, he began the conversation that would slowly set him free. The following week, Frank made a decision. He would start going to therapy. He had resisted the idea for years, convinced that he could handle things on his own. But after his conversation by the river with the older man, he knew that it was time to confront his demons in a way he hadn't before. The night he called Rachel to tell her about his decision, she was quiet on the other end of the line. Frank could hear the relief in her silence, like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. For so long, she had wanted him to seek help, to face the pain that had haunted him since his time in the service. But she had never pushed too hard, always giving him space to come to the decision on his own. "Dad, I'm so proud of you," Rachel said, her voice thick with emotion. "I know this isn't easy, but it's the right thing. And I'll be here for you every step of the way." Frank's heart swelled. He hadn't realized how much he needed her approval until that moment. For the first time, he truly felt like he wasn't doing this alone. The therapy sessions weren't easy. At first, Frank found himself sitting in silence, unsure of how to start, unsure if he even wanted to start. His therapist, a kind woman named Dr. Morgan, didn't push him. She let him talk when he was ready, letting him guide the conversation. But slowly, over time, he began to open up. In the beginning, Frank focused on his military experiences, the fear, the chaos, the loss of comrades who had been more like brothers. Each memory was a painful reminder of who he used to be, of a version of himself that he felt was lost forever. Dr. Morgan never rushed him, instead allowing him to explore these feelings at his own pace. "Frank," she said one day, after he had shared a particularly difficult memory, "you've carried these experiences for so long, thinking you have to bear it all alone. But you don't. You don't have to carry this weight by yourself anymore." That's when it hit him. The realization that he had been living his life in isolation, cut off not just from others, but from himself. The fear, the shame, the anger. He had buried all of it, hoping it would fade. But it hadn't. It was still there, festering beneath the surface. Frank began to understand that healing wasn't just about forgetting the past or numbing the pain. It was about accepting it. It was about facing the darkest parts of himself and learning to live with them. He had to forgive himself, just like the older man by the river had suggested. He had to stop running from his own story. One afternoon, as Frank was leaving Dr. Morgan's office, he ran into someone he hadn't expected to see, Mike, his old army buddy. They stood there for a moment, both surprised to see each other in the same place. "Frank, is that really you?" Mike said, his voice incredulous. Frank smiled, a mix of surprise and relief washing over him. "Mike? Wow, it's been so long. What are you doing here?" Mike looked down at the ground for a moment, a slight hesitation in his movements. "I've been seeing a therapist too," he said quietly. "After everything, I didn't realize how much I was carrying around. I guess I thought I could deal with it on my own, but it got to be too much." Frank's heart swelled with gratitude. He hadn't known what to expect when he reached out to Mike. But this, seeing his old friend in the same place, taking the same steps toward healing, was something he had never anticipated. They stood together in silence for a while, the weight of their shared experiences hanging between them. But this time, it wasn't the kind of silence that suffocated. It was the kind of silence that came with understanding. "Maybe we should grab a drink sometime," Mike suggested, breaking the silence. Frank nodded, his throat tight. "Yeah, I'd like that." That evening, as Frank sat in his small apartment, he thought about his day, the therapy session, the unexpected meeting with Mike. His life, once so fractured and isolated, was beginning to come together. Slowly, but surely. There was still a long road ahead of him. There would be more difficult conversations, more painful memories to unpack. But for the first time in years, Frank felt hopeful. The past might always be a part of him, but it didn't have to define him. He didn't have to be the man he once was, the man who ran from his emotions, the man who numbed his pain with alcohol. He had a chance to rebuild, to reclaim his life. And for the first time, he realized that he wasn't just doing it for himself. He was doing it for Rachel, for his grandchildren, for the family that had taken him back in, despite everything. The next weekend, Frank called Rachel and told her about his decision to continue therapy. She was supportive, of course, but he could hear the relief in her voice. She invited him over for dinner that night, wanting to celebrate his progress, even if it was small steps at a time. As he walked into Rachel's home that evening, he felt a sense of belonging that he hadn't felt in years. The laughter of his grandchildren filled the air, and Rachel was in the kitchen, humming as she prepared the meal. "Grandpa!" Lily shouted as she ran toward him, her arms wide open. Frank scooped her up in his arms, feeling a warmth spread through him. "Hey, kiddo," he said, smiling. "How's my favorite little girl?" "I'm doing good. We're gonna play a game after dinner," Lily said excitedly, her eyes sparkling. Frank chuckled, his heart light. "Sounds like fun." Rachel came into the living room, wiping her hands on a towel. "Everything's ready," she said, beaming at Frank. "We've all been so proud of you, Dad. You're doing great, and we're here for you, every step of the way." For the first time in a long time, Frank didn't feel like he was carrying the world on his shoulders. There was something comforting in knowing that he had a support system, something to hold on to when the memories tried to pull him back. As they sat down for dinner, Frank felt a quiet satisfaction. The past would always be a part of him, but it didn't have to control his future. He had his family, he had therapy, and he was ready to keep moving forward, one step at a time. Frank's journey toward healing was neither smooth nor linear. It was a delicate dance between progress and setbacks, a constant tug-of-war between his past and his future. But despite the challenges, he knew he had to keep moving forward. In the weeks following his decision to attend therapy, Frank began to feel a subtle shift. The nightmares, which once came relentlessly, now came less frequently, their grip loosening as Frank slowly addressed the memories he had long buried. The sessions with Dr. Morgan became a safe place where Frank could confront his fears and his guilt, things he had never been able to articulate before. Still, there were moments when the weight of his silence became unbearable, when the past seemed to echo louder than the present, like the old, familiar smell of gunpowder that lingered in his senses, or the random flashes of faces, his comrades, who had been lost to the war. Sometimes, it felt like those faces were all he could see when he closed his eyes. They haunted him, not in a way that scared him, but in a way that reminded him of what he had lost, of what he could never get back. One particularly difficult evening, after an intense therapy session, Frank sat alone in his small apartment. The silence around him was deafening. He hadn't spoken much to Rachel or Mike in the last few days. He felt like he needed space. The memories of the war were starting to come back, crashing through his defenses, dragging him back to places he hadn't been in years. His mind drifted to a specific moment in his life, a memory he hadn't shared with anyone. It was during his final days in combat, the day he lost his closest friend, Jimmy. Jimmy had been like a brother to him. They had shared everything, from jokes about their families back home to their hopes of returning to civilian life. But all of that changed in the blink of an eye. Frank could still see it. The explosion, the dust, the fire. Jimmy had been standing next to him, and in one cruel instant, he was gone. Frank had survived, but Jimmy hadn't. The guilt of it had been suffocating, a constant companion during his years on the streets, making him numb to the world around him. He had convinced himself that the only way to cope was to shut down, to not feel anything at all. But now, in the quiet solitude of his apartment, the memory hit him with full force. The tears came without warning. Frank's hands shook as he wiped his face, not knowing what to do with the overwhelming grief that had resurfaced after all these years. He had never allowed himself to mourn for Jimmy. He had never allowed himself to feel the loss, to truly grieve. It was then that Frank realized something he hadn't fully acknowledged before. In order to heal, he would have to face not just his own demons, but the pain he had carried for others as well. He wasn't just carrying the weight of his own survival. He was carrying the weight of everyone he had lost along the way. Frank sat in the silence for what felt like hours, allowing himself the space to feel the grief he had long denied. He could still hear Jimmy's laugh in his head, see his face as clear as day. It was a painful memory, but it was also a reminder of the love and camaraderie they had shared, something that no war could take away. The following day, Frank woke up feeling heavy, but not defeated. He knew that the path ahead wasn't going to be easy, but he was beginning to understand that healing wasn't about forgetting or erasing the past. It was about making room for those memories without letting them define him. And so, he decided to call Rachel. It was time to talk. "Hey, Dad." Rachel's voice was warm when she picked up the phone. "Everything okay?" Frank paused, taking a deep breath. "I've been thinking," he started slowly, "about Jimmy and everything that happened. I don't know if I've ever really talked about it, but I think it's time I did." Rachel was silent for a moment. Frank could tell she was listening intently, waiting for him to continue. "I lost him, Rachel. I don't think I ever really grieved. I didn't know how to. I didn't know how to talk about it, but I think I need to." Rachel's voice softened. "You don't have to do it alone, Dad. I'm here. We're all here for you." That evening, Frank sat down with Rachel at her kitchen table. He didn't have all the words to explain his feelings, but he knew that sharing his grief with her was a step toward healing. Rachel listened, her eyes never leaving him, her hand resting gently on his. "You've been carrying this for so long," she said softly, "and you don't have to anymore. We're a family, Dad. We'll carry it together." Frank looked at her, his heart swelling with gratitude. He had spent so many years running from his emotions, convinced that they were too much to bear. But here, in this moment, he understood what he had never truly understood before. Healing was not a solitary process. It was about allowing others to share in the burden, about letting love and connection become part of the cure. The next day, Frank decided to visit the cemetery where Jimmy was buried. It had been years since he had been there, and he had never visited alone. The thought of facing Jimmy's grave had always been too much for him, too raw. But now, he felt ready. He stood by the grave, the wind cold against his face, and allowed himself to simply be still. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel the need to fill the silence with distractions or excuses. He just stood there, breathing in the reality of what he had lost. The loss of a friend, a brother, someone who had shared the same hopes and fears. "I'm sorry, Jimmy," Frank whispered, his voice barely audible. "I couldn't save you. I couldn't bring you home. I didn't know how to handle it. I still don't, but I'm learning. I promise you, I'm learning." Tears fell freely, and Frank didn't try to stop them. For the first time, he allowed himself to mourn, to grieve, to release the guilt that had shackled him for so long. It wasn't about forgetting Jimmy. It was about letting go of the burden of survival, about honoring his friend's memory in a way that was healthy, in a way that would allow him to continue living. As Frank left the cemetery, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't an instant fix. There was still pain, still sorrow, but it was a new kind of peace, one that didn't require him to bury his emotions or ignore his past. He could carry the weight of his memories without being consumed by them. And for the first time in a long time, Frank felt like he could finally breathe again. The road to healing would continue, but with each step, Frank knew that he was not alone. He had his family. He had his memories. And most importantly, he had begun to understand that the most difficult part of moving forward was allowing himself to truly feel. It had been a few weeks since Frank had visited Jimmy's grave, and while the memories still stung, they no longer haunted him. He had finally made peace with the loss, accepting that it was a part of his journey, a part of his story. The therapy sessions with Dr. Morgan continued, and though they remained difficult at times, he felt more equipped to handle them. But the most significant change had come from the unexpected ripple effect of his decision to heal. Frank had begun to notice a subtle shift not just in himself, but in the people around him as well. He wasn't the only one who had been carrying burdens in silence. It was a Saturday morning when Frank received a phone call from Mike, his old army buddy. The conversation had been light at first. Mike had heard about Frank's therapy and wanted to catch up, but then Mike mentioned something that stopped Frank in his tracks. "I've been thinking about what you said, Frank. About facing the past," Mike said quietly. "I think it's time I do the same. I've been carrying this stuff around for so long, and I don't even know where to start anymore." Frank was taken aback. He had never thought of Mike as someone who needed therapy. He had always seemed so strong, so in control. But now, hearing his old friend speak those words, Frank realized just how much they had both been hiding from the world. "Mike," Frank said slowly, "I get it. I really do. It's hard, but it's worth it. I've been going through therapy, and while it hasn't been easy, it's helping. You don't have to carry this stuff on your own, man." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then Mike let out a long sigh. "Yeah, I guess I've been avoiding it for too long. Maybe it's time to face it." Frank felt a sense of solidarity in that moment, knowing that Mike had come to the same realization. They didn't have to carry their pain in isolation anymore. They could face it together, even if they were miles apart. Later that week, Frank received a letter from his daughter, Rachel. She had always been supportive of his healing journey, but she had never fully understood what he was going through until recently. In her letter, she thanked him for his openness and vulnerability, for sharing his grief about Jimmy, and for finally allowing himself to heal. She wrote, "Dad, I know this hasn't been easy for you, but I've never been prouder of you. You're not just healing yourself. You're teaching all of us something. You're showing us that it's okay to not be okay, and that we don't have to carry the weight of the past forever. I love you, and I'm here for you." Reading Rachel's words brought a lump to Frank's throat. He hadn't realized how much his journey toward healing had affected her. It was as if he had unknowingly given her permission to confront her own struggles. The thought that his vulnerability could inspire others was humbling. It made him think about the impact of his decisions on the people around him. It wasn't just about him anymore. His healing was a ripple, extending out to touch the lives of those he loved. One afternoon, as Frank was sitting in the park, watching the kids play, he noticed an elderly man sitting on a bench nearby. The man was staring out at the lake, his posture slumped, as if the weight of the world rested on his shoulders. Frank recognized something in the man's expression, a familiarity he couldn't quite place. Without thinking, Frank walked over to the bench and sat down beside him. The man looked up in surprise, and Frank offered him a kind smile. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" Frank said, breaking the silence. The man nodded but didn't respond. He seemed lost in thought. After a moment, Frank spoke again, this time softer. "You look like you've got a lot on your mind. You okay?" The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared down at his hands, his fingers trembling. Then, after a long pause, he spoke. "I've been carrying a lot of things for a long time. Things I don't even know how to talk about," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know if I can ever let them go." Frank felt a surge of empathy for the man. He had been there, had felt that same sense of isolation and despair. "You don't have to carry it alone," Frank said, his voice steady. "I've been where you are, and it's not easy, but it's worth it. Talking about it, facing it, it can help. Maybe not right away, but it will." The man looked at him, eyes filled with a mixture of skepticism and hope. "You really think so?" "I know so," Frank replied, with a conviction he hadn't known he had. The man let out a deep breath, as if considering Frank's words. "Maybe I'll think about it," he said finally, his voice quieter now. "I just don't know if I have the strength to face it." Frank placed a hand on the man's shoulder, offering a small, reassuring squeeze. "It's not about strength," he said softly. "It's about taking the first step. The rest will come." The man nodded, his eyes distant, but for the first time, there was a flicker of something else in his gaze. Maybe a bit of hope, or at least the idea that things could change. That evening, as Frank sat in his apartment, reflecting on his conversation with the elderly man, he couldn't help but feel grateful. Grateful for the connections he was making, for the healing he was experiencing, and for the opportunity to share his journey with others. It was then that he realized something profound. Healing wasn't just about overcoming personal trauma. It was about building bridges, about reaching out to others who were struggling and offering them the same understanding that he had received. He had been given a second chance at life, and now he had the power to offer that same hope to someone else. As he thought about the people he had met, the man in the park, Mike, Rachel, Frank understood that his healing journey wasn't just about him. It was about the impact he could have on others, about the way his choices could ripple outward, creating waves of change. The next morning, Frank received another unexpected call. This time, it was from Dr. Morgan. She had been following his progress closely and wanted to check in. "I just wanted to tell you how impressed I am with the progress you've made, Frank," she said warmly. "You've worked hard, and I can see it. You've really started to confront things in a way that's going to help you heal in the long run." Frank smiled, grateful for the support. "It hasn't been easy, but I'm getting there." "That's the important thing," Dr. Morgan replied. "Remember, healing is a journey, not a destination. You're doing the right work, and I'm proud of you." As he hung up the phone, Frank felt a sense of peace wash over him. He was no longer the man who lived in isolation, consumed by his past. He had taken the first step toward healing, and that first step had already made a difference, not just in his life, but in the lives of those around him. And as he looked out the window, watching the sun rise over the horizon, Frank knew that while his journey wasn't over, it was only just beginning. As the weeks passed, Frank's life began to settle into a new rhythm. The pain he had carried for so long still lingered, but it no longer controlled him. It was a part of him, yes, but it didn't define him anymore. Therapy had become a cornerstone of his healing, and though it was still difficult, Frank had come to understand the power of confronting his past, rather than running from it. He was no longer haunted by his memories in the same way. They were still there, but they no longer had the power to shackle him. Frank's relationships with his family had deepened. Rachel had become more than just his daughter. She had become his confidant, his support system, the person who grounded him in the moments when the past tried to rise up again. Mike, too, had started his own journey toward healing. They would talk occasionally, sharing stories of progress, frustrations, and the small victories that came with facing their demons head-on. But it wasn't just his family and friends that Frank was reconnecting with. It was his sense of purpose. For the first time in years, Frank had something to work toward beyond his own survival. It had been Mike's idea. He had called Frank one evening and told him about a local organization that helped homeless veterans get back on their feet. They provided resources like job training, therapy, and housing. Mike, who had been struggling with his own situation, was determined to get involved, and he thought Frank could be the perfect person to help. "You've got the experience, Frank," Mike had said. "You've lived it. You know what these guys need. You can make a real difference." At first, Frank had been hesitant. He wasn't sure he was ready to be around other veterans. Not yet. He still had his own healing to do. But after a few days of thinking it over, he realized that maybe helping others was the very thing he needed to heal. After all, he had spent so many years feeling lost and alone. Perhaps, by giving back, he could finally find his own way forward. The first day Frank visited the organization, he felt a mix of nervousness and excitement. The building was small but warm, with pictures on the walls of veterans who had overcome their struggles. There was a sense of camaraderie in the air, a shared understanding among everyone present. Frank walked through the door and was greeted by a volunteer named Terry, who had been working with veterans for years. "Welcome, Frank," Terry said with a smile. "We're so glad to have you here." Frank smiled back, feeling a little out of place, but also a bit of hope stirring in his chest. He had spent so much time in isolation that he wasn't sure he belonged in a group like this. But as he spent more time there, meeting the veterans, hearing their stories, he began to realize that he was exactly where he needed to be. Over the next few weeks, Frank found himself immersed in the work. He was helping other veterans navigate the complicated systems of social services, job applications, and therapy. He shared his own experiences with them. His time on the streets, his struggles with PTSD, his decision to seek therapy, and how he had slowly begun to rebuild his life. He listened to their stories, too, offering words of encouragement when he could. It was exhausting work, but it also felt incredibly rewarding. For the first time in years, Frank felt like he was making a difference. He wasn't just another homeless veteran. He was someone who had lived through the worst of it and had come out the other side. And now, he was helping others do the same. One afternoon, Frank was sitting in a small meeting room with a young veteran named Jason. Jason had served in the Marines and had been struggling with depression and anger since he returned home. He had tried to numb the pain with alcohol, but it only made things worse. Frank could see the frustration in Jason's eyes, the same frustration he had felt all those years ago. "I don't know if I can do this, Frank," Jason said, his voice tight with emotion. "I'm not sure I can handle everything, what I've been through, what I've lost." Frank leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "I get it, Jason. I really do. I was there. But I'm telling you, there's a way out. You don't have to do it alone. We're all in this together." Jason didn't say anything at first, but Frank could see the glimmer of hope in his eyes. It wasn't much, but it was there. And that was enough for now. As Frank continued to work with veterans, he found that his own healing was deepening. The more he gave, the more he received. The more he helped others confront their past, the more he was able to confront his own. It was as if by guiding them, he was also guiding himself. He started to feel a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. He wasn't just a man who had been broken by his experiences. He was someone who could help others rebuild. It was a role he hadn't known he could fill, but now, it was a role he embraced wholeheartedly. One evening, after a long day at the center, Frank returned home to his apartment, exhausted but fulfilled. He sat on his couch, reflecting on everything he had experienced. The memories of war, the pain of loss, and the struggle to survive. All of it was still there. But now, it was part of a larger story. A story of resilience, of survival, and of redemption. As Frank sat there, he realized something profound. Healing wasn't just about moving forward. It was about taking what had happened and turning it into something meaningful. He had spent so many years trying to bury his past, but now he understood that it was a part of him, a part of the story he had to tell. And by sharing that story, by helping others, he had finally found his way forward. The next day, Frank met with Rachel for lunch. They hadn't had much time together lately, and Frank was eager to share his progress. "I've been thinking a lot," he said as they sat down at a small cafe, "about what I'm doing with my life. Helping other veterans. It feels right, Rachel. It feels like I'm finally doing something that matters." Rachel smiled, her eyes bright with pride. "I'm so proud of you, Dad. I can see the change in you. You're not just healing yourself, you're helping others heal, too." Frank's heart swelled with gratitude. He hadn't realized just how much he had needed validation from her. Her words meant more than she could know. "I'm not sure I would have gotten here without you, Rachel," Frank said quietly. "You've been my anchor. And now, I'm finally starting to feel like I have something to give back." Rachel reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "You always had something to give, Dad. You just needed to find it." Frank smiled, feeling a deep sense of peace. He knew the road ahead wouldn't always be easy. There would still be moments of doubt, of pain, of memories that threatened to overwhelm him. But for the first time in years, he felt hopeful. He had found his purpose. And with that, he was ready to face whatever came next. As Frank continued his work with the veterans, the progress he had made in his own life began to feel more solid. His past, though painful, had transformed into something he could use to help others. The more he shared his story, the more it seemed to connect with those he was trying to help. Each conversation, each breakthrough, each shared struggle and triumph was a small step forward, not just for the people he was helping, but for himself as well. But despite the healing he had experienced, Frank knew that there were still bumps along the way. Life wasn't a straight path, and some days were harder than others. Still, the sense of purpose he had found in helping others was something that kept him grounded, even when the weight of his own memories started to feel heavy again. It was an unusually hot day when Frank received a call that would challenge everything he had worked for. He was sitting in his apartment, taking a break from paperwork for the Veterans Center, when his phone rang. He didn't recognize the number but picked it up anyway. "Hello?" he said, his voice slightly tired from the long day. "Is this Frank Dawson?" The voice on the other end was sharp, businesslike. "Yeah, this is Frank," he answered. "We're calling about your trial date," the voice continued. "The court has set a new hearing. It's been postponed several times, but now it's finally here." Frank's heart skipped a beat. He had almost forgotten about the trespassing charge that had loomed over him for so long. When he had been arrested, it had felt like a distant memory, something that would eventually fade, something that didn't define him. But now, hearing the official tone on the other end of the line, Frank realized that the past still had its grip on him. The date is set for next Wednesday, the voice said, giving Frank the details. You'll need to be there, or we'll issue a bench warrant. He nodded, even though the person on the other end of the line couldn't see him. I'll be there, he said quietly, the weight of the situation settling on his shoulders. As the call ended, Frank sat in silence for a moment, his mind racing. The trial was going to be a major test, one he wasn't sure he was ready for. It wasn't just about the legal consequences. It was about confronting the past in a way he hadn't fully prepared for. He had worked so hard to rebuild his life, to put the trauma behind him, and now he was being pulled back into it. He wondered how it would affect everything he had worked for. Could he really move forward if his past kept chasing him? The next few days were filled with anxiety. Frank tried his best to focus on the work he was doing at the Veterans Center, but every conversation, every task, was overshadowed by the looming trial. He hadn't told anyone about the court date. He wasn't sure he was ready to explain to those around him that the charges from his past were still haunting him. Rachel called to check in on him, sensing that something was off. Frank hadn't told her about the trial yet, but she knew him too well. You don't sound like yourself, Dad, she said, her voice filled with concern. What's going on? Frank hesitated, then let out a deep breath. I have to go to court next week. The trespassing charge from a while ago. It's all coming back up. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Frank could hear Rachel taking in the information, trying to process it. Dad, why didn't you tell me? She asked quietly. I didn't want to burden you, Frank admitted. I've been working so hard to move past it. I thought if I ignored it, it would just go away. Dad, Rachel said, her voice now firm, you don't have to do this alone. I'm here for you. We're going to get through this together. Frank felt a swell of gratitude for his daughter. She had always been his rock, and now more than ever, he needed her strength. It was clear to him that his past might never truly be gone, but he didn't have to face it alone. Rachel's words gave him the courage he needed to face the trial head-on. On the day of the trial, Frank woke up early. The morning sun was already peeking through his window, and the air felt heavy with anticipation. He had dressed in the best clothes he had, a button-up shirt and a pair of slacks that, for the first time in years, fit him well. He was nervous, but there was something else in him too, a sense of readiness. He had faced so many battles in his life, and while this one was different, it was still part of his journey. He drove to the courthouse with a tight knot in his stomach. As he parked his car, he saw a few other people milling about, but his focus remained on the doors in front of him. He took a deep breath and walked inside, where he was greeted by a receptionist who led him to the waiting area. When Rachel arrived, Frank felt a wave of relief wash over him. She had taken the morning off work to be there for him, and her presence was a reminder that he wasn't alone. She squeezed his hand tightly as they waited for the trial to begin. When his name was finally called, Frank stood and walked into the courtroom, his heart pounding. The room was filled with people, lawyers, witnesses, and a judge presiding over the case. The charge was simple: trespassing on private property. Frank had been living on the streets at the time, trying to survive any way he could, and one night, he had stumbled into a vacant lot and fallen asleep. He had never intended to cause trouble, but the law didn't care about his circumstances. As the trial began, Frank listened to the prosecutor lay out the facts of the case. His defense attorney, a kind man named Sam, stood by his side, offering a few words in Frank's defense. He spoke of Frank's struggles, his time in the military, the trauma he had endured, and the years spent living without a stable home. It wasn't a perfect defense, but it was honest. When it was Frank's turn to speak, he took a deep breath and walked up to the stand. The silence in the room felt suffocating, but Frank did his best to hold his ground. Your Honor, he began, his voice steady, I know I made a mistake that night. I was struggling, and I didn't know where else to go. But I've worked hard to turn my life around. I'm not that man anymore. I'm not perfect, but I'm trying every day to be better. His words hung in the air, and for a moment, there was complete silence. Frank didn't look around, but he could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on him. He knew that this was more than just about the trespassing charge. It was about everything he had been through, everything he had survived. Finally, the judge spoke. "Mr. Dawson," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I've heard your story, and I've seen the progress you've made. I believe in second chances. I'm going to offer you a chance to complete community service in lieu of jail time. But understand this, your actions have consequences. Take this as an opportunity to continue on the path you've started, and never let it lead you back to where you were." Frank felt a wave of relief wash over him, and he nodded, his heart lightened by the decision. It wasn't over, but it was a chance, a new beginning. As Frank left the courthouse, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The past had tested him, but he had passed. He had faced his demons head-on and come out on the other side. Rachel hugged him tightly, tears in her eyes. "You did it, Dad," she whispered. Frank smiled through his own tears, knowing that this was another step in the long journey of healing. The path ahead would still be filled with challenges, but he was no longer afraid. He had learned that the past didn't define him. It was simply part of his story, one that he could now share with others, showing them that no matter how dark the past may be, there was always hope for a brighter future. The days following Frank's trial felt like a new chapter in his life had begun. It wasn't just the relief of knowing the trespassing charge was behind him. It was the recognition that he had truly taken ownership of his life's story. There was power in facing your past, not just in the legal sense, but in the emotional sense. Frank had looked his struggles in the eye, accepted them, and then turned them into something meaningful. And now, he was ready for whatever came next. The community service he had been assigned wasn't exactly easy, but it wasn't as daunting as Frank had expected either. It wasn't about sweeping streets or picking up litter. It was about helping others who had fallen through the cracks, just like he had. The work was fulfilling, and for the first time in years, Frank felt like he had a tangible way to give back to the world. The Veterans Center, too, continued to be a source of purpose. Frank had been working there more regularly, leading support groups and mentoring younger veterans who had recently returned from overseas. As he listened to their stories, he saw so much of his own reflection in them. Their struggles with reintegration, their battles with PTSD, their doubts and fears, they all mirrored the things Frank had fought through in his own life. One of the veterans, a young man named Aaron, had particularly caught Frank's attention. Aaron was just a few years younger than Frank had been when he enlisted, and like Frank, he carried a lot of unresolved trauma from his time in service. Frank saw a lot of himself in Aaron. The reluctance to talk about his struggles, the walls he'd built around his emotions, the refusal to let anyone in. Aaron had started coming to the center a few months earlier, and at first, he didn't seem to want anything to do with the group. He'd sit in the back, barely speaking, and if anyone tried to approach him, he'd quickly close himself off. Frank had tried to talk to him a few times, but Aaron's responses were always short and dismissive. But Frank hadn't given up. He knew what it was like to feel invisible, to feel like no one understood what you were going through. So, he kept showing up, kept offering a listening ear, until one day, Aaron finally opened up. It was during a particularly quiet session when Aaron finally spoke. The group had just finished discussing a recent deployment, and there was an uncomfortable silence in the room. Frank was just about to break it when Aaron suddenly spoke. "I don't know what to do anymore," Aaron said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to live with this feeling that I'm always at war with myself." The words hit Frank like a punch to the gut. He remembered what it felt like to be in that dark place, the weight of the past crushing down, making it seem impossible to move forward. But he had found a way, slowly but surely. And he knew that Aaron could, too. Frank leaned forward, his voice calm and steady. "I understand, Aaron. I've been where you are. I felt the same way for a long time. But there's a way out of that darkness. It takes time, but there's hope. You don't have to do it alone." Aaron looked up, his eyes full of doubt. "I don't know if I can trust anyone again." Frank nodded slowly, understanding the depth of that fear. "It's not easy, I know. But the first step is to just talk. Talk to someone, even if it's just a little bit. That's how we start to heal." The conversation didn't end there, but it was the beginning of something important for Aaron. Over the next few weeks, Frank continued to be a support for him. Little by little, Aaron began to open up more, started sharing bits of his past, and slowly began to trust the group. Frank saw in Aaron's eyes the same glimmer of hope he had once felt when he first realized that he could change, that he could move forward. But just as things seemed to be stabilizing, a new challenge came into Frank's life. It was a Thursday afternoon when he got the call. He had just finished a session at the Veterans Center and was heading home when his phone rang. It was Rachel. "Dad, I need to talk to you," she said, her voice urgent. "It's about Mom." Frank's stomach dropped. He hadn't spoken to his ex-wife, Linda, in months. Their relationship had always been strained, but he had hoped that time apart would give them both the space to heal. Now, hearing Rachel's voice on the phone like this, he knew something had happened. "What's going on?" Frank asked, his mind racing. "She's in the hospital," Rachel replied, her voice cracking. "She had a stroke. It's pretty serious." Frank felt the blood drain from his face. Linda had never been in great health, but he hadn't expected anything like this. The news hit him harder than he anticipated. He had moved on from their past, but there was still a part of him that cared for her. After all, she was the mother of his children. Is she going to be okay?" Frank asked, his voice shaking. "We don't know yet. The doctors are still running tests," Rachel said. "But Dad, I think you need to come to the hospital." Without thinking, Frank hung up the phone and grabbed his keys. He didn't know what he was walking into, but he knew that he couldn't just sit back and let this moment slip by. It was time to face yet another part of his past, something he thought he had left behind. When Frank arrived at the hospital, he found Rachel in the waiting room, looking exhausted and overwhelmed. She stood up when she saw him, rushing over to give him a hug. "Dad, I'm so glad you're here," she said, her voice strained with emotion. Frank took a deep breath and pulled her into a tight hug, trying to be the rock she needed in this moment. "It's going to be okay, sweetheart. We'll get through this." The hours that followed were a blur. Frank and Rachel spent most of the afternoon sitting by Linda's bedside, waiting for the doctors to give them an update. It was a tense, draining time, but Frank stayed focused on his daughter. He knew that she needed him, and he wasn't about to let her down. When the doctor finally came in to speak with him, Frank held his breath, unsure of what the next few words would bring. "She's stable for now," the doctor said, "but it's still too early to say how much recovery she'll have. It's going to be a long road." The news wasn't as bad as it could have been, but it was far from reassuring. Frank knew that the next few months would be difficult, not just for Linda, but for the entire family. And while the years had not been kind to his relationship with her, he knew that his role now was to help Rachel through this. As Frank sat by his ex-wife's hospital bed later that evening, he found himself reflecting on the past. It was strange how time worked, how things he thought were long gone could resurface in the blink of an eye. But he was no longer the man he used to be. He had learned to face his past and keep moving forward. With Rachel by his side, and with the lessons he had learned from helping others, Frank knew that he could face this new challenge. It wasn't going to be easy, but he had come too far to turn back now. The journey was far from over, but he was ready for whatever came next. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Frank was no longer the man he had once been. He had found redemption, not in forgetting his past, but in using it to build something better for himself and for those he cared about. Frank sat quietly in the hospital room, watching the steady beep of the machines monitoring Linda's condition. The glow of the fluorescent lights above seemed to dim as the weight of the situation pressed on him. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, about the past, about mistakes, about regrets, but most of all, about how much time had slipped away. It had been decades since he'd really looked at his ex-wife. Sure, they shared their children, and they exchanged the occasional pleasantry, but they had long since ceased being anything more than strangers living parallel lives. Linda had her own battles, just as Frank had his, but seeing her lying there, vulnerable and fragile, made him realize how much their shared history still had a hold on him. Even after all these years, the ties between them weren't as easily severed as he'd once thought. Rachel had stepped out for a moment, giving Frank the chance to sit in solitude, thinking. There was a part of him that still felt resentment toward Linda. The marriage hadn't ended amicably, and Frank had carried a lot of that bitterness with him for a long time. But now, in this quiet room, facing the woman who had once been his closest companion, Frank couldn't help but feel something different, a quiet, unexpected sense of duty. It was strange. He hadn't expected to feel this way. It wasn't that Frank believed everything could be fixed. No, too much had been said, too much had been broken. But there was a bond that went deeper than the anger they'd both carried. They had shared a life together, a family, dreams, even small moments of happiness. And despite the distance time had created between them, he couldn't just walk away from that. The thought lingered as Frank sat by Linda's bedside, his fingers gently tapping on the armrest of his chair. He wasn't sure what kind of role he could play in the coming days, or how involved he could be in her recovery, but the decision to be present, really present, was something that felt important. Maybe it was about showing Rachel that family mattered, that no matter how complicated things had been, they still had to stick together. When Rachel returned to the room, she noticed the change in her father's demeanor. He wasn't as tense anymore. He wasn't fidgeting with his hands, lost in his own thoughts. There was a quiet resolve in his eyes. "Dad, you okay?" Rachel asked, taking a seat next to him. Frank nodded slowly. "I think so," he said. His voice was steady, though there was an underlying layer of vulnerability that Rachel hadn't heard before. "I know it's been hard for you," Rachel continued. "The divorce, everything that happened. And I know you've had a complicated relationship with Mom." Frank exhaled a slow breath. "Yeah, I guess you could say that." "It's okay," she said, reaching out to give his hand a comforting squeeze. "You don't have to explain it. I know it's been tough for both of you, but I'm just glad you're here now. For her. And for me." Her words hit him in a way he hadn't anticipated. His role in his daughter's life had shifted over the years. He'd gone from being her father to just another distant figure. But hearing Rachel's vulnerability now, seeing how much she depended on him, it reminded Frank of what truly mattered. He squeezed her hand back. "I'm here, Rach. I know we've had our differences, but I'm not going anywhere." The next few days were a blur of hospital visits, medical updates, and moments of reflection. Linda's condition was stable, but still critical. The doctors had warned that the road to recovery would be long, and there were no guarantees. Frank found himself spending more and more time at the hospital, not just for Linda, but for Rachel as well. Each visit was an emotional roller coaster, but it was during these moments that Frank began to see something he hadn't fully understood before. Family wasn't just about shared blood or history. It was about showing up for each other when it mattered most. It was about being there in the quiet moments of uncertainty and pain, when words didn't come easy, but presence was everything. On the fourth day, Frank was sitting in the hospital waiting area, flipping through a magazine when his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from Aaron. "Hey, Frank. You doing okay? You've been off the radar lately. Let me know if you need anything." The message felt like a lifeline. It wasn't just that Frank needed to talk to someone outside of this intense situation. It was that Aaron, who had been through so much himself, understood the need for connection during times of crisis. They had formed a bond over the past few months, and Frank appreciated the simplicity of the message. No pressure, just a check-in. Frank quickly typed back, "Thanks, Aaron. It's been tough, but we're getting through it. I'll call you soon." He sat back, staring at the message for a moment longer than usual. He had come to care about Aaron in ways he hadn't expected. The young veteran had reminded Frank of himself, the loneliness, the uncertainty, the overwhelming burden of the past. But Aaron was learning, just as Frank had, to find his way forward. And Frank had realized that in helping Aaron, he was also helping himself. The day Linda was moved out of intensive care, Frank took a step outside the hospital to get some air. The cool breeze felt refreshing, the sunlight breaking through the clouds as if reminding him that there was still light in the world, even when things felt dark. Rachel was inside with her mother, but Frank needed this moment of solitude. He needed time to reflect on what had happened in his life, how far he had come, the battles he had fought, and the choices he had made. He thought about the man he had been and the man he was becoming. It was clear now that the road ahead would never be easy. The past would always have its pull, its grip on him. But Frank knew something he hadn't known before. His story wasn't finished. There was still more to write, still more to learn, and still more people who needed him, whether he fully understood how or not. As he stood on the sidewalk, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from the Veterans Center. "Frank, the group has been asking about you. We miss you. Let us know if you need anything." For a moment, Frank simply smiled. He had found a new purpose in these people, people who, like him, had fought their own battles and come out on the other side. And now, it was his turn to help lead them forward. With a deep breath, Frank typed a response. "I'll be there soon. Thanks for checking in." As he returned to the hospital, ready to face whatever came next, Frank understood that the ties that bind weren't just the ones formed by shared blood or history. They were the ones built through shared experience, shared struggle, and the mutual understanding that, no matter what, they were not alone. The days that followed Linda's stroke continued to challenge Frank in ways he hadn't expected. It wasn't just the stress of the hospital visits or the uncertainty of Linda's recovery. It was the deep, unresolved feelings that resurfaced every time he looked at her. Frank had spent so many years distancing himself from the past, from the pain of his marriage and all that had come with it. But now, with Linda lying in a hospital bed, Frank was forced to confront those emotions head-on. He had spent so long blaming her for their failed marriage, convinced that it was her fault things had fallen apart. But now, as he watched Rachel care for her mother, something in Frank shifted. Maybe it wasn't about blame at all. Maybe it was about understanding that they had both played a part in the unraveling of their relationship. And in that understanding, there was room for forgiveness, not just for Linda, but for himself as well. One evening, after another long day at the hospital, Frank took a walk around the hospital grounds, needing a break from the sterile environment. He'd learned that it was in moments like these, when he gave himself space to think, that clarity often came. And tonight, the air was crisp and clear, the sky painted with soft shades of purple and orange as the sun dipped below the horizon. His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from Rachel. "Mom's awake. She's asking for you." The message struck him like a bolt of lightning. He wasn't sure if he was ready to face Linda in her current state. He wasn't sure if he was ready to confront everything that had happened between them. But he knew he couldn't keep running from it. With a deep breath, Frank made his way back to the hospital, feeling the weight of the moment on his shoulders. When he entered the room, Rachel was sitting beside Linda's bed, holding her hand. Linda's eyes were open, but they were glassy and distant. She was still weak from the stroke, and the life that had once radiated from her seemed dimmed. Rachel stood up when Frank entered, her eyes tired but filled with relief. "Dad, she's been asking for you." Frank nodded, stepping toward Linda's bed. He stood there for a moment, unsure of what to say, unsure of what he could offer. But then Linda's eyes locked onto his, and in that instant, he saw something. A vulnerability, a recognition that they were both caught in this moment together. "Frank," Linda whispered, her voice hoarse. "I'm sorry." The words hit Frank harder than he expected. For so many years, he had carried the weight of their divorce like a badge of honor, convinced that he was the one who had been wronged. But in that single, simple apology, Linda had undone all of that. She had acknowledged the pain, the mistakes, the years they had spent apart. Frank swallowed hard, fighting back the emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. "It's okay," he said, his voice shaky. "It's not just you. I've made mistakes too." They sat in silence for a moment, both of them taking in the magnitude of what had been said. The years of anger and resentment, the wounds they had both carried, suddenly felt lighter. There was still so much work to be done, so much healing to be had. But in this moment, Frank felt a shift. Maybe this was the beginning of something new. The days turned into weeks, and slowly, Linda began to recover. She was still far from being her old self, but there was progress. Her speech improved, and she regained some mobility in her limbs. The doctors remained cautiously optimistic, though they warned that full recovery would take time. Frank and Rachel spent hours at the hospital, helping Linda with her physical therapy and encouraging her every step of the way. Throughout it all, Frank found himself visiting the Veterans Center less frequently. He had been so involved in the center's activities, leading groups, offering support to other veterans, but now his focus was divided. He felt torn between his responsibilities to Linda, to Rachel, and to the veterans who had become like family to him. But he couldn't ignore the growing pull inside him. He had found something in helping others, something that had given him purpose after so many years of wandering aimlessly. And while his family needed him, Frank knew that he couldn't abandon the work he had started with the veterans. He had to find a balance between his past and his future, between his family and the community that had supported him. One afternoon, after a particularly tough physical therapy session with Linda, Frank received a call from Aaron. He hadn't heard from him in a few days, and he wondered if the young veteran had been struggling again. "Hey, Frank," Aaron said, his voice sounding a little off. "I just wanted to check in and see how you're doing. You haven't been at the center lately, and I wanted to make sure everything's all right." Frank sighed, rubbing his forehead. "Yeah, it's been a bit hectic. Linda's been in the hospital, and I've been trying to be there for Rachel. It's been a lot." Aaron was silent for a moment. "I get it. Family's important. But don't forget about the people who are here for you too, Frank. We all need support." Frank leaned back in his chair, taking in Aaron's words. He had always been the one to offer support, to be the strong one. But Aaron was right. He needed people too. "Thanks, Aaron," Frank said quietly. "I've been caught up in everything going on here, but I won't forget about you. Or the group." "I know you won't," Aaron said with a chuckle. "We'll be here when you're ready to come back. But don't forget, sometimes the best way to help others is to take care of yourself first." Frank smiled, grateful for Aaron's wisdom. He was right, of course. It was easy to get lost in the chaos of life, to put everyone else's needs ahead of your own. But Frank knew that he couldn't pour from an empty cup. If he was going to help others, he had to make sure he was okay first. As the weeks went by, Frank found his balance again. He continued to support Linda and Rachel, but he also returned to the Veterans Center, making time for the veterans who had come to mean so much to him. He found strength in those moments of connection, in the shared stories and struggles that bound them together. The road to redemption was never a straight path. It was full of detours, setbacks, and unexpected challenges. But Frank had learned that it wasn't about the destination. It was about the journey. It was about showing up, day after day, and doing the best you could, even when it felt like the weight of the world was too much to bear. For Frank, redemption wasn't a single moment. It was a process, a series of choices and actions that added up over time. And with each choice, each action, he was building something new. Something that was no longer defined by his past mistakes, but by the man he was becoming. One evening, as Frank sat in the quiet of his apartment, reflecting on everything he had been through, he thought about all the people who had helped him along the way. His family, the veterans, the strangers who had become friends. Each one had played a part in his transformation. Frank had found a new sense of purpose, not in what he could achieve for himself, but in what he could offer to others. And in that giving, in that support, he had found a version of himself that he could finally be proud of. The journey wasn't over, but Frank no longer feared what lay ahead. He was ready to face it, one day at a time. The sun was setting as Frank stood outside the Veterans Center, the familiar sign above him casting a long shadow on the pavement. The world seemed to slow down around him, the air cool against his skin. For the first time in a long while, he felt at peace, as if everything that had happened, the chaos, the heartache, the uncertainty, had led him to this moment. The past few months had been a whirlwind. Linda's recovery had been slow, but it was progress. She was still living with Rachel, and Frank visited as often as he could. They had made peace with each other in a way that he never thought possible. There were still difficult moments, of course, and the scars of their marriage remained, but they had learned to coexist in a way that allowed them to be present for their children and each other. Rachel, too, had grown stronger. She had taken on the role of caregiver with a resilience that reminded Frank of the strength she had always possessed, even as a child. And yet, she had also learned to lean on him when the burden of caregiving became too heavy. It was a delicate balance, but one they had managed to navigate together. As for Frank, he had made peace with his own past. The days of walking through life weighed down by bitterness and regret were behind him. He had learned to forgive, not just Linda, but himself. He had also learned the value of community. The veterans who had once been strangers to him were now family, and he had come to realize that, just as they had supported him, he could now offer that same support in return. Tonight was different. Tonight, Frank was not just visiting the Veterans Center as a participant. Tonight, he was leading a meeting. After months of being involved in their lives, offering guidance, and sharing his story, the group had asked Frank to step up and lead. He had agreed, not out of obligation, but because he felt ready. It was as if all his years of struggle, all his attempts to find meaning, had led him to this moment, leading others who had been through their own battles. He took a deep breath as he entered the center. Inside, a group of veterans sat around a large table, some familiar faces, others new. They looked up as he entered, a quiet respect in their eyes. Frank had earned that respect through his actions, through his willingness to be vulnerable, to share his own story of hardship and recovery. "All right, everyone," Frank began, his voice steady. "Let's get started." He could feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about talking through strategies or coping mechanisms. This was about something deeper, about connection, about shared experience, about finding hope in the darkest of times. It was about creating a space where these men and women could feel seen, heard, and valued. As Frank spoke, he noticed the faces of the veterans around him. Some were nodding along, others were deep in thought, but all of them were engaged. There was an energy in the room, a quiet intensity that told Frank he was making an impact. He wasn't just another voice telling them what they should do. He was a living example of what could happen when you chose to face your struggles head-on, to seek help, and to support each other. "We've all been through our own versions of hell," Frank continued, his voice gaining strength. "But the key to getting through it isn't doing it alone. It's about finding the people who will walk with you, who will listen when you need to talk, who will help you when you can't help yourself. That's what this group is about. We're all in this together." There was a quiet murmur of agreement from the group. Frank paused, taking a moment to let his words sink in. "Some of us have been through the worst," he said, his voice softer now. "I know I have. But I also know that there's a way out. It's not easy. Hell, sometimes it feels impossible. But I'm standing here today because I didn't give up. I kept going and I found my way. And I believe you can too."